Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a vast ocean, once feared as a dark and uncertain boundary at the edge of the known world, gradually became one of the busiest highways in human history, carrying ships, goods, and millions of lives between continents? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, along with your local time. I always enjoy seeing how far these quiet history journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the close of the 15th century, Europe stood at the edge of a changing world. For generations, trade with Africa and Asia had moved along long overland routes or across the Mediterranean Sea. These journeys were slow, expensive, and controlled by many middlemen. Kings and merchants were constantly searching for ways to reach distant markets more directly. Among the most determined of these explorers were sailors from Portugal. Portugal was a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, facing the Atlantic Ocean. Its location encouraged maritime travel, and its rulers invested heavily in navigation. Ships grew sturdier. Maps became more detailed. Navigators learned to follow winds and currents across long stretches of water. Portuguese expeditions began to move steadily down the west coast of Africa during the early 1400s. At first, these voyages were cautious and exploratory. Sailors charted coastlines, noted river mouths, and recorded the locations of trading communities. They encountered established African societies with long traditions of commerce that stretched deep into the continent. Gold was one of the earliest attractions. West Africa possessed rich gold sources, and Portuguese merchants were eager to exchange goods for the precious metal. Trade soon expanded to include ivory, spices, and other valuable products. Small coastal trading posts began to appear, marking the first European footholds along the region's shoreline. These early encounters did not immediately create the massive system that would later define the Atlantic slave trade. At the beginning, the scale remained limited, yet the foundations were being laid. European merchants realized that the Atlantic Ocean, once considered a barrier, could become a network connecting continents. Navigation skills improved year by year. Mariners learned to take advantage of wind patterns known today as the Atlantic gyres. By following predictable currents, ships could sail south along the African coast and then return northward through wide arcs across the ocean. These discoveries slowly transformed the geography of trade. At the same time, European demand for labour was beginning to change. Certain industries required large numbers of workers, especially in new agricultural enterprises. Sugar cultivation, which had spread from the Mediterranean world, required intensive labour for planting, harvesting, and processing. Plantation systems began appearing on Atlantic islands under Portuguese control. Madeira, an island discovered by Portuguese sailors in the early 15th century, became one of the first testing grounds for this new agricultural model. Sugar plantations were established there with remarkable speed. Forests were cleared, irrigation systems were built, and mills were constructed to crush sugarcane. Running these plantations required steady labour. Early settlers experimented with different forms of work arrangements, including indentured servants and local labourers. Over time, enslaved workers from Africa were increasingly brought to the island. The system that emerged there would later influence plantation economies across the Atlantic world. Other islands followed a similar path. The Azores and Cape Verde Islands also became centres of maritime activity. Ships travelling between Europe and Africa frequently stopped there to replenish supplies and prepare for longer voyages. These islands served as stepping stones across the ocean. Meanwhile, European curiosity about the wider Atlantic continued to grow. Stories circulated about lands far beyond the horizon. Some sailors believed Asia might be reachable by sailing west. Others simply sought new opportunities for trade and exploration. The year 1492 brought a dramatic development when Christopher Columbus sailed west under the sponsorship of Spain. Although Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia, His voyages revealed lands unknown to Europeans. These territories would soon become central to the expanding Atlantic world. As Spanish settlements began to appear in the Caribbean, the economic possibilities seemed enormous. Sugar, tobacco, and other crops thrived in the tropical climate. Yet these new colonies faced an immediate challenge: labour. The indigenous populations of the Caribbean suffered severe population declines due to disease, conflict, and harsh working conditions. Spanish colonists struggled to maintain agricultural production without a large workforce. Officials began searching for alternative labour sources. By this time, Portuguese traders had already established commercial contacts along the African coast. They had experience transporting captives across relatively short distances to Atlantic islands. What had once been a regional trade began to attract wider attention from European powers. Ships capable of long ocean crossings were now common. The same vessels that carried sugar, gold, and spices could also carry people. As Spanish colonies expanded, the demand for labour grew more urgent. A connection began to form between the African coast and the emerging colonial economies of the Americas. The Atlantic Ocean gradually transformed into a space of constant movement. Ships sailed from Europe carrying textiles, metal goods, and manufactured items. They stopped at African trading ports where merchants exchanged these goods for captives taken through various conflicts and raids inland. From there, vessels crossed the ocean toward the Americas. At this early stage, the system was still developing. Routes were not yet fully standardized. Merchants experimented with different patterns of trade. Some voyages were profitable, while others ended in loss due to storms, illness, or navigation errors. Nevertheless, the economic incentives were powerful. Sugar plantations produced enormous wealth for those who controlled them. European markets had developed a strong appetite for sugar, which was no longer considered merely a rare luxury. As consumption increased, so did the demand for labour to cultivate the crop. By the early 1500s, the outlines of a new Atlantic economy were becoming visible. European merchants, African trading networks, and American plantations were beginning to form an interconnected system. Goods and people moved along routes that would eventually become known as the triangular trade. The transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually through countless voyages, negotiations, and shifting political arrangements. Kings issued charters, merchants formed partnerships. Shipbuilders improved their designs to carry larger cargoes across longer distances. Along the West African coast, fortified trading posts began to appear. These structures served multiple purposes. They were warehouses, administrative centres, and defensive strongholds designed to protect valuable goods. Over time, they also became locations where captives were held before being transported across the ocean. European traders did not operate alone. African rulers and merchants played important roles in regional commerce. Long-established trade networks extended from the interior to the coast. These networks connected communities through systems of exchange that had existed for centuries before European arrival. As the 16th century advanced, these networks became increasingly entangled with Atlantic commerce. Some African leaders viewed the trade as an opportunity to gain access to European goods, weapons, and alliances. Others attempted to control the flow of captives through their territories. The Atlantic system continued to expand with each passing decade. Ships became more numerous, ports grew busier. European states began to compete for influence over these profitable routes. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all sought a place within the growing maritime economy. At sea, navigators refined their techniques. Instruments such as the astrolabe and later the sextant helped determine latitude. Detailed charts recorded coastlines and currents. Experienced captains passed down knowledge of seasonal winds that could speed or delay a voyage. These developments slowly turned the Atlantic Ocean into a well-understood environment rather than an unknown frontier. Merchant fleets began following predictable seasonal patterns. Voyages were planned months in advance based on weather conditions and market demands. For the people carried across these routes, however, the experience was profoundly different. Captives transported on early voyages often came from diverse regions of West and Central Africa. Many had lived in agricultural communities or trading towns far inland. The journey to the coast itself could involve long marches and unfamiliar landscapes. When they reached coastal trading centres, they entered a world shaped by the expanding Atlantic economy. European ships waited offshore. Cargoes were inspected and negotiated through complex transactions involving multiple intermediaries. From these beginnings, the Atlantic slave trade would grow into one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Over the next 3 centuries, millions of people would be transported across the ocean. The system would influence economies, cultures, and political structures across 3 continents. Yet in the early decades of the 16th century, the scale was still developing. The process unfolded gradually, driven by trade incentives, imperial competition, and the expanding plantation economies of the Americas. The ocean routes that Portuguese sailors had first charted for exploration and commerce were now becoming the arteries of a new Atlantic world. Ships moved along these pathways year after year, connecting distant shores in a network of exchange that reshaped global history. The Atlantic Ocean, once a wide and uncertain horizon, had become a corridor linking Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The consequences of that connection would unfold over the centuries that followed. Portugal builds a new trade system. During the early 16th century, Portugal did not simply stumble into a profitable Atlantic business and then drift along with it. It built one, piece by piece, through a mixture of royal planning, merchant ambition, maritime skill, and repeated contact with African coastal societies. What began as exploratory travel along the western coast of Africa gradually hardened into a system with routines, stations, contracts, and expectations. That system was not yet the vast, mature slave trade of the 18th century, but the shape of it was becoming clear. The Portuguese crown wanted wealth, merchants wanted reliable returns, and colonial settlements wanted labour. Between those demands, a durable framework began to emerge. Portugal's advantage came from timing and persistence. It had started Atlantic exploration earlier than most of its European rivals, and by the start of the 1500s, it possessed decades of practical knowledge about African waters. Portuguese sailors knew where to anchor, where currents ran strongly, where seasonal winds could help or delay a voyage, and which coastal zones offered the safest commercial access. In a world where maritime uncertainty could destroy an expedition, this mattered a great deal. A merchant venture did not succeed on courage alone. It depended on predictability. The more predictable the routes became, the easier it was to turn scattered voyages into regular commerce. The Portuguese crown had long treated seaborne expansion as a state concern rather than a purely private adventure. Royal sponsorship, licenses, monopolies, and charters were used to guide activity. This did not mean that the crown directly managed every exchange on every shoreline. It meant that rulers in Lisbon tried to define who could trade, where they could trade, and what share of the profits might return to the monarchy. In practice, private merchants, captains, agents, and local intermediaries carried much of the burden, but the state gave structure to the enterprise. It drew the lines within which the system operated. One of the earliest foundations of Portuguese Atlantic commerce was the establishment of fortified coastal posts. These outposts were not random warehouses dropped beside the sea. They were carefully chosen footholds placed where trade could be concentrated and observed. Their location mattered. A useful post needed access to established African trading routes, reasonable security, and a harbour where ships could anchor long enough to load cargo. These forts became centres of exchange where merchants stored European goods, negotiated terms, and organised departures. They also offered symbolic value. A stone fort on a distant coast announced that Portugal intended to remain. Among the best known was Elmina, established in 1482 on the Gold Coast. Although first tied strongly to the gold trade, Elmina became part of a broader commercial world in which enslaved people also figured more prominently over time. The fort represented a new way of doing business. Rather than relying entirely on fleeting shipboard exchanges, the Portuguese could maintain a semi-permanent presence. They could gather information, monitor rivals, and create local relationships that outlasted a single voyage. These advantages helped shift Atlantic trade from improvisation toward administration. The goods that Portuguese merchants brought to Africa varied by region and period, but textiles, metalware, weapons, alcohol, beads, and other manufactured items were common parts of exchange. These were not just random objects unloaded from a hold. Merchants learned through experience which goods were desired in particular coastal markets and which held less value. This meant that trade required knowledge, and knowledge was profitable. A captain who understood regional preferences stood a better chance of filling his ship efficiently. One who misunderstood local demand could waste a season and lose heavily. Portuguese trade along the African coast depended on African participation at every stage. European merchants did not sweep inland, collecting captives on their own. Coastal commerce relied on African rulers, brokers, merchants, interpreters, and transport networks. Inland warfare, judicial enslavement, political rivalries, debt systems, and kidnapping all fed captives into regional markets, though the proportions differed across time and place. The Portuguese entered existing worlds of exchange, but their presence altered incentives inside those worlds. As demand rose across the Atlantic, the value of captive labour increased, and with that rise came terrible consequences for many communities. In these early centuries, Portugal did not control the African interior, and often it could not even dictate terms on the coast as confidently as later European myths suggested. Portuguese agents negotiated. They bargained. They sought favour. They adjusted to local rulers who could permit, restrict, or reshape the trade. In some places, African authorities welcomed commercial relations as a means of obtaining imported goods and strengthening their own political position. In other places, relations remained unstable or suspicious. The system expanded not because Portugal commanded every shore, but because enough local arrangements could be made, renewed, and defended. As trade became more regular, islands in the Atlantic became increasingly useful to Portuguese strategy. Cape Verde, lying off the West African coast, served as a practical intermediary space. It was a stopping point, a settlement zone, and an administrative bridge between Lisbon and African markets. The islands also became places where mixed communities developed, shaped by European settlers, free Africans, and enslaved people. Cape Verde's position made it valuable for communication, ship repair, storage, and redistribution. It was one of several nodes that helped turn scattered commercial voyages into an organised oceanic network. São Tomé became even more important in another sense. Located in the Gulf of Guinea, it emerged during the late 15th and early 16th centuries as a major sugar-producing island. Its plantations required large numbers of labourers, and enslaved Africans became central to its economy. São Tomé showed how closely plantation agriculture and slave trading could reinforce one another. The island was not merely a consumer of enslaved labour. It was also tied to regional trading systems that reached into the mainland. In this way, it acted both as a plantation colony and as a commercial hinge between African supply zones and Atlantic markets. The Portuguese were learning a hard commercial lesson that would shape the next 3 centuries. Labour-hungry plantation, agriculture, and maritime transport could be fused into one integrated business model. Sugar was especially important in teaching that lesson. It required investment, land clearance, machinery, fuel, transport, and steady discipline of labour. Once cane was ripe, it had to be cut and processed quickly. Delays could ruin value. Plantation owners therefore favoured labour arrangements they believed they could control completely. Enslavement provided that control from the perspective of owners, while imposing relentless hardship on the people forced to work. These early plantation experiments were crucial because they gave merchants and rulers a practical example of how profitable forced labour could be under Atlantic conditions. Madeira had already offered a smaller model. São Tomé deepened it. Later, Brazil and the Caribbean would expand it massively. But before that wider explosion, Portugal spent decades refining the basic connection between shipping, captive labour, and export agriculture. This refinement did not happen in theory. It happened through account books, cargo tallies, seasonal losses, and repeated attempts to make the system more efficient. Efficiency shaped the design of voyages. Ships were loaded not simply with goods, but with a sequence of exchange in mind. A vessel leaving Portugal might carry textiles, metal tools, and other commodities intended for African markets. Once exchanged for captives or other valuables, it would continue onward or return depending on its route, winds, and commercial purpose. Captains had to calculate space, food, water, disease risk, and timing. The growth of the trade meant that more of these calculations became standardized. A business system takes shape when experience turns into routine. That was increasingly happening in Portuguese Atlantic commerce. The legal side of trade also grew more elaborate. Licenses and permissions mattered because the crown wanted revenue and order, or at least as much order as could be managed from a distance. Some merchants obtained rights through contracts. Others operated through semi-legal arrangements, partnerships, or local deals. Smuggling and evasion appeared early, because wherever monopoly and profit coexist, people search for shortcuts. Still, the Crown's efforts to regulate trade helped define categories of commerce and legitimate routes. This bureaucratic layer made the system more durable. A trade written into laws, contracts, and tax records is harder to dismiss as temporary. Lisbon itself changed through this expansion. The city became a maritime capital where information from Africa, the Atlantic islands, India, and later Brazil flowed into one political centre. Merchants, sailors, royal officials, artisans, and financiers all participated in this wider oceanic economy. Goods from faraway regions moved through its docks, so did people. Enslaved Africans were present in Portugal itself by the 16th century, especially in urban domestic labour and related work. This fact matters because the Atlantic slave system was never only overseas. Its effects were visible inside European societies too, including in cities that profited from it. The language of commerce often disguised the human reality underneath it. Cargoes were counted, returns were estimated, losses were recorded, investors discussed percentages and markets. Yet the trade in captives was never like the trade in cloth or ivory, however often merchants tried to make it seem so in their records. Portuguese expansion helped normalize a commercial habit of reducing human beings to units of labour and exchange value. That habit would become one of the defining features of the Atlantic slave trade. Once embedded in law and business, it could spread far beyond the original context in which it formed. Religion also played a complicated role. Portugal was a Catholic monarchy, and Christian language often accompanied imperial expansion. Missionary activity existed alongside trade, and rulers sometimes framed overseas activity as part of a broader religious mission. Yet commercial motives remained powerful and often plain. Conversion, diplomacy, and profit moved together, not always comfortably. In some African kingdoms, Christian ties were pursued sincerely by local rulers for political and spiritual reasons. In others, religion functioned mainly as part of diplomatic theatre. What mattered for trade was that Portugal could present itself as both a commercial partner and a Christian kingdom with imperial legitimacy. Relations with the Kingdom of Congo reveal some of this complexity. The Congo leadership engaged with the Portuguese in diplomacy, religion, and commerce beginning in the late 15th century. Elites converted to Christianity, correspondence was exchanged, and political alliances were explored, yet the relationship was never simple. Congo sought advantage and recognition on its own terms, while Portugal pursued economic gain and influence. Over time, the demand for captives created intense strain. As Atlantic slave trading expanded, the pressures it generated reached deeper into Central African political life, contributing to instability and conflict that rulers could not always contain. Portuguese merchants also pushed farther south along the African coast, connecting with regions in present-day Angola and beyond. These connections would become increasingly important as Brazil rose later in the 16th and 17th centuries. For now, the key point is that Portugal kept widening its commercial geography. The system was not fixed to one narrow strip of coastline. It was elastic. It adapted as markets shifted, as local politics changed, and as colonial demand increased. Flexibility made the trade harder to disrupt in its early stages. Another important feature of Portuguese commerce was the use of intermediaries who could cross cultural and linguistic boundaries. Interpreters, mixed heritage traders, local brokers, and resident agents helped bridge gaps between European merchants and African markets. These figures often disappear in broad historical summaries, yet they were essential to the functioning of the trade. A system this large could not operate through royal decree alone. It required countless practical acts of translation, mediation, persuasion, and local knowledge. Trade was built by people who knew how to move between worlds. By the middle decades of the 16th century, the Portuguese had created far more than a set of profitable routes. They had established habits of Atlantic commerce that others would later imitate, challenge, and enlarge. They linked coastal forts to island plantations to ocean shipping, and shipping to colonial labour demands. They showed that an empire could extract wealth not only from spices or precious metals, but from the forced movement of human beings into plantation labour systems. This was the grim commercial breakthrough. Portugal's traders, officials, and settlers helped convert scattered slaving practices into a transoceanic structure with regular routes, dependable markets, and legal backing. The structure was still growing, still uneven, and still vulnerable to local disruption, but it was now recognisable. It had ports, paperwork, investors, forts, crops, and buyers. Above all, it had momentum. That momentum would carry forward into the broader Atlantic world. Spain would soon demand more labour in the Americas. Sugar production would spread. Rival European powers would enter the field. African states would confront the growing distortions created by Atlantic demand. The Portuguese had not created slavery itself, which long predated them in many parts of the world. What they helped build was something narrower and more far-reaching at once, a maritime system that turned slavery into one of the central engines of Atlantic expansion: sugar, labour, and Atlantic islands. By the early 16th century, the Atlantic world was already beginning to reveal the economic pattern that would dominate the next 300 years. Certain crops thrived in warm climates near the equator. European consumers were willing to pay steadily rising prices for those products, and producing them required large numbers of workers, performing difficult and repetitive labour in fields and mills. Among these crops, sugar quickly became one of the most important. For centuries, sugar had been known in parts of Asia and the Middle East. It eventually spread into the Mediterranean world during the medieval period, where plantations appeared in regions controlled by various European and Islamic powers. The process of cultivating sugarcane and refining it into crystals was labour-intensive and technically demanding. Fields had to be cleared and planted carefully. When the cane ripened, it had to be cut quickly and transported to mills where heavy rollers crushed the stalks. The juice was then boiled and processed into sugar. This work required constant coordination between agriculture and machinery. Large teams of labourers were necessary during planting seasons, harvesting periods, and the long hours of processing inside boiling houses. The economic success of sugar depended on maintaining this labour supply without interruption. Portuguese merchants and settlers discovered that several Atlantic islands offered ideal environments for this crop. Madeira, located northwest of Africa, became one of the earliest examples. After Portuguese explorers reached the island in the early 15th century, settlers began clearing its forests and preparing farmland. Sugarcane was introduced soon afterward. Within a few decades, Madeira's landscape had changed dramatically. Terraced fields spread along hillsides. Irrigation channels carried water from mountain streams down to plantations. Sugar mills appeared across the island, powered by water wheels that crushed cane into juice ready for refining. European demand for sugar grew quickly. What had once been a luxury item used sparingly by wealthy households slowly became more common across European markets. Merchants realized that Atlantic plantations could produce sugar in quantities far larger than Mediterranean estates. Profits rose accordingly, yet the system required labor on a scale that small colonial settlements struggled to provide. At first, plantation owners experimented with several types of workers. Some laborers were European settlers hoping to establish farms of their own. Others were indentured servants who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage to the island. However, these sources rarely supplied enough labor to maintain the expanding sugar fields. Enslaved workers from Africa gradually became a larger part of the workforce. Portuguese traders already had commercial connections along the West African coast. Ships moving between Africa and Atlantic islands could transport captives taken through regional conflicts or raids. The journey from the African mainland to Madeira or other islands was shorter than the later transatlantic crossings, but it still marked a forced displacement that separated individuals from their homes and communities. As plantation agriculture expanded, enslaved Africans became central to the operation of sugar estates. Plantation owners considered them a permanent labor force that could be controlled and directed according to the needs of the estate. The system that emerged on Madeira and nearby islands created a model that would later be copied on a much larger scale. Another Portuguese island colony, São Tomé, developed into an even more significant centre of sugar production during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Situated in the Gulf of Guinea, São Tomé possessed fertile volcanic soil and a tropical climate well suited for cane cultivation. Portuguese settlers established plantations across the island and invested heavily in sugar mills. Because São Tomé lay close to the African mainland, merchants found it easier to transport enslaved labourers to the island. Coastal trading networks provided access to captives who were then moved across the short stretch of ocean to the plantations. Over time, São Tomé became one of the largest sugar producers in the Atlantic world. Its exports travelled across European markets, and its economic success demonstrated how profitable plantation agriculture could become when supported by enslaved labour. The organisation of plantations followed a structured hierarchy. Owners and managers supervised the estates. Skilled workers operated mills and machinery. Large groups of field labourers planted, cut, and carried cane. Each stage of production required coordination, and plantations functioned as tightly controlled environments designed to maintain constant output. Sugar production was particularly demanding, because the cane crop deteriorated quickly after harvest. Once cut, the stalks had to reach the mill without delay. Workers operated day and night during harvest seasons to ensure that the crop could be processed before spoiling. For enslaved labourers, the work was exhausting and dangerous. The machinery used in sugar mills could cause severe injuries, while the heat from boiling houses exposed workers to burns and constant fatigue. Plantation schedules left little room for rest during peak seasons. At the same time, the economic success of these plantations encouraged further investment. Merchants financed new estates. Mill owners expanded their equipment. Ship captains carried increasing quantities of sugar across the Atlantic toward European markets. The Atlantic islands became important laboratories for this plantation model. Settlers experimented with different methods of cultivation, irrigation, and milling. They also refined systems of labour management designed to maximise production. These practices would later be transferred to larger colonies across the Atlantic. As the 16th century progressed, European interest in overseas territories continued to expand. Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and Central America were developing agricultural economies of their own. Portuguese Brazil, which would soon become a major sugar producer, also began attracting attention from investors and settlers. The knowledge gained on Atlantic islands played a major role in shaping these future plantations. Farmers who had worked in Madeira or São Tomé sometimes travelled to the Americas, bringing with them practical experience in sugar cultivation. They understood how to organise fields, construct mills, and manage large groups of workers. Their expertise helped spread the plantation system across the wider Atlantic world. Merchants followed similar patterns. Trading networks developed that linked European ports, African coastal markets, Atlantic islands, and American colonies. ships rarely sailed empty. Goods moved continuously along these routes as part of a growing maritime economy. The increasing demand for enslaved labour gradually expanded the scale of the slave trade. What had once been a regional trade supplying Atlantic islands began reaching farther across the ocean. Plantations in the Americas required workers in numbers far greater than small island colonies. Brazil became especially significant in this transition. Portuguese explorers had claimed the territory in the early 16th century, and settlers soon recognised that its climate and land were ideal for sugar cultivation. Plantations spread along the northeastern coast where conditions favoured cane production. These Brazilian estates were far larger than the earlier plantations of Madeira or São Tomé. Their owners required thousands of labourers to clear forests, cultivate fields, and operate mills. African captives were transported across the Atlantic in increasing numbers to meet this demand. The Atlantic islands therefore served as an important bridge between earlier Mediterranean plantation systems and the massive agricultural economies that later developed in the Americas. Techniques tested on small islands proved adaptable to much larger colonial landscapes. European governments also recognized the financial potential of these developments. Taxes on sugar exports produced significant revenue. Monarchs granted trading licenses and commercial privileges to merchants willing to invest in overseas ventures. At the same time, European populations were becoming more familiar with sugar as a regular part of daily life. It appeared in baked goods, drinks, and preserved foods. As consumption grew, the economic importance of plantations increased. The Atlantic world was slowly reorganizing itself around these flows of goods and labour. Ships departing Europe carried manufactured items that could be exchanged along African coasts. From there, captives were transported to plantations across the Atlantic. The plantations then produced crops such as sugar that were shipped back to European markets. Each stage of the journey supported the next. By the middle of the 16th century, the system linking African labour, Atlantic plantations, and European consumption had begun to stabilise. Although still evolving, it already demonstrated the powerful economic forces that would shape the next several centuries of Atlantic history. The islands of Madeira and São Tomé had shown that plantation agriculture could produce enormous wealth under the right conditions. Their success encouraged further expansion into the Caribbean and Brazil, where land and climate offered even greater possibilities. With every passing decade, ships travelled more frequently between continents. Port cities grew busier. Merchants invested larger sums in maritime trade. The Atlantic Ocean had become the centre of a new economic world. And within that world, sugar plantations stood as one of the strongest engines driving the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. Spain enters the Atlantic world. By the early decades of the 16th century, Spain had become one of the most powerful empires connected to the Atlantic Ocean. The voyages of Christopher Columbus had opened routes between Europe and the Caribbean, and Spanish settlements were spreading across islands that were previously unknown to Europeans. These early colonies were not immediately prosperous. Many settlers arrived hoping to find gold or valuable minerals, but the first years of colonization often brought hardship instead of wealth. Yet the Spanish presence in the Caribbean gradually expanded. Settlements appeared on islands such as Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Small towns formed around harbours where ships could anchor and unload supplies. Spanish administrators attempted to organise these new territories under royal authority, establishing systems of governance that connected the colonies directly to the Spanish crown. The early Spanish colonies depended heavily on the labour of indigenous populations. Spanish settlers expected local communities to work in mines, fields, and construction projects. Various colonial systems, such as the encomienda, were introduced to organise this labour. Under this arrangement, Spanish colonists received the right to demand labour or tribute from indigenous communities in exchange for providing protection and religious instruction. In practice, the system placed enormous strain on indigenous societies. Many people were forced to work under harsh conditions in mines or plantations. At the same time, diseases carried from Europe spread rapidly through populations that had never encountered them before. Illnesses such as smallpox and measles caused severe population declines across many parts of the Americas. Within a few decades of Spanish arrival, the number of indigenous workers available for colonial labour had dropped dramatically in several regions of the Caribbean. This created a serious problem for Spanish settlers. The agricultural estates and mining operations they had established depended on a large and steady workforce. Spanish authorities began searching for alternatives. At first, some colonists attempted to bring labourers from Spain itself, but the journey across the Atlantic was long and expensive. Many European settlers were more interested in owning land than performing the heavy labour required on plantations. As a result, Spanish colonial leaders started looking toward the African coast as a potential source of workers. Portugal already had experience trading along the African shoreline, and Portuguese merchants had established connections with coastal trading networks. Spanish authorities realized that they could purchase enslaved Africans through these existing routes. Over time, Spanish colonial officials began requesting permission from the Crown to import African labourers into the Caribbean. The Spanish monarchy initially approached this issue cautiously. Royal officials were concerned about maintaining control over colonial trade and ensuring that profits returned to Spain. To regulate the supply of enslaved labourers, the Crown developed a system of licenses that allowed merchants to transport a certain number of captives to the colonies. These licenses eventually evolved into a formal contract system known as the Asiento. Under the Asiento system, the Spanish Crown granted selected merchants or trading companies the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies for a fixed period of time. In return, the merchants agreed to deliver a specific number of captives and pay taxes or fees to the Crown. This arrangement allowed Spain to regulate the trade without organising the voyages itself. Private merchants handled the risks and logistics of transporting captives across the Atlantic, while the Crown collected revenue from each shipment. The Asiento contracts often involved merchants from several different countries. Although Spain controlled the American colonies, Portuguese traders remained deeply involved in the African side of the trade during the 16th century. In later periods, merchants from other European nations would also participate. Meanwhile, Spanish colonies in the Americas continued to grow. Agricultural estates expanded across the Caribbean islands. Crops such as sugar, tobacco, and indigo became valuable exports. Plantations required labourers for planting, harvesting, and processing crops. As these plantations increased in size, the demand for enslaved workers also rose. The Caribbean climate proved well suited for sugar cultivation. Spanish settlers began building mills and refining facilities similar to those already used on Portuguese Atlantic islands. Plantation agriculture gradually replaced smaller farms as the dominant economic system in many areas. The introduction of enslaved African labour reshaped colonial society. Enslaved workers were transported across the Atlantic in ships organised specifically for that purpose. These voyages marked the beginning of what would later become known as the Middle Passage. Once in the Caribbean, enslaved individuals were sold to plantation owners or colonial administrators. They were then assigned to work in fields, mills, construction projects, or domestic service. Spanish colonial records began to list growing numbers of enslaved Africans arriving each year. The social structure of colonial societies also began to change. Spanish settlers formed the highest level of colonial authority, supported by royal officials and local elites. Below them were mixed communities that included Europeans, indigenous peoples, and Africans. Over time, these groups created new cultural traditions shaped by the blending of languages, religions, and daily practices. African cultural influences appeared in music, food, agricultural techniques, and religious traditions throughout the Caribbean. Enslaved people brought knowledge and skills from their homelands, which often shaped the way plantations operated. Some individuals were experienced farmers who understood tropical agriculture. Others were skilled artisans or metal workers. Despite the harsh conditions of plantation labour, enslaved communities developed social networks that helped preserve aspects of their cultural heritage. Families formed whenever possible, and traditions were passed down across generations. The expansion of Spanish colonies also encouraged further exploration of the American mainland. Spanish expeditions travelled across Central and South America during the early 16th century. Conquistadors established control over large territories, including the Aztec and Inca empires. These conquests dramatically expanded Spain's access to natural resources, especially silver mines in regions such as present-day Mexico and Peru. Mining operations required thousands of labourers. Although indigenous workers were still heavily involved in mining systems, enslaved Africans were also transported to certain regions where colonial administrators needed additional labour. The economic wealth generated by these colonies flowed across the Atlantic towards Spain. Ships carrying silver, sugar, tobacco, and other goods sailed regularly between American ports and Spanish cities such as Seville. Seville became one of the most important administrative centres of the Spanish Atlantic Empire. The city controlled much of the official trade with the Americas through institutions designed to regulate shipping and collect taxes. Merchants gathered there to organise voyages and invest in colonial commerce. As Spanish trade expanded, other European powers began watching closely. England, France, and the Netherlands were eager to challenge Spanish and Portuguese dominance in the Atlantic. Their merchants hoped to gain access to the profitable trade networks connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Over time, these rivalries would reshape the Atlantic economy. For now, however, Spain remained one of the central powers in the expanding system. Its colonies required large numbers of labourers, and enslaved Africans became an increasingly significant part of that workforce. The early 16th century, therefore, marked a turning point. What had begun as regional trading networks along the African coast was evolving into a vast transatlantic system linking continents together. Ships crossed the ocean in both directions, carrying goods, people, and information. Colonial economies depended on this constant movement, and European governments competed to control it. Spain's entry into the Atlantic slave trade helped accelerate the growth of the entire system. With large colonies in the Americas demanding labour, the scale of transatlantic transportation increased steadily. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer simply a frontier explored by adventurous sailors. It had become the central pathway of a growing global economy, one that connected African markets, European merchants, and American plantations through an expanding network of trade routes. The Asiento and imperial contracts. As the 16th century progressed, the Spanish Empire found itself managing a rapidly expanding network of colonies across the Atlantic. These territories required administrators, soldiers, settlers, and above all, a dependable labour force. The demand for labour continued to grow as plantations spread and mining operations expanded. Spanish officials understood that supplying workers to distant colonies required organisation on a large scale, and they began building administrative systems to regulate the trade that connected Africa to the Americas. One of the most important of these systems was known as the Asiento. The word referred to a formal contract granted by the Spanish crown that allowed a merchant or company to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. Rather than managing the trade directly, the monarchy licensed private traders to handle the business. These traders agreed to deliver a specific number of captives within a defined period of time, while paying taxes and fees to the crown. This arrangement offered advantages to both sides. The Spanish monarchy avoided the cost and complexity of running long-distance trading voyages itself, while merchants received legal permission to participate in a profitable enterprise. The system also allowed the Crown to maintain oversight of colonial labour supplies, ensuring that the expanding plantations and settlements did not run short of workers. The Asiento contracts were usually granted for several years at a time. Merchants who obtained these agreements gained exclusive rights to deliver enslaved Africans to Spanish territories during the duration of the contract. Because the privileges could generate substantial profits, competition for the contracts was intense. Traders from different parts of Europe sought royal approval to secure these opportunities. Portugal remained deeply involved in this process during the early phases. Portuguese merchants had the strongest trading connections along the African coast, and they possessed ships, forts, and commercial networks that made large-scale transportation possible. As a result, Many early Asiento holders relied on Portuguese traders to obtain captives from African markets. The practical work behind the Asiento involved a long chain of organisation. Merchants had to finance ships, hire crews, purchase trade goods, and arrange negotiations along the African coast. Captains needed to know the safest routes and seasonal winds for crossing the Atlantic. Once ships reached the Americas, the captives were delivered to colonial markets where they were sold to plantation owners, mine operators, or colonial administrators. Because the Crown taxed each captive delivered to the colonies, Spanish officials kept careful records. These records tracked the number of enslaved Africans transported through the system and the payments owed to the monarchy. The paperwork also helped officials monitor whether merchants were meeting the obligations specified in their contracts. The Asiento system did not always operate smoothly. Merchants sometimes struggled to deliver the full number of captives promised in their agreements. Storms, disease, shipwrecks, or conflicts along trading routes could disrupt voyages. When shipments failed to meet expectations, disputes arose between merchants and the Crown regarding financial penalties or contract terms. Despite these difficulties, the Asiento became one of the central mechanisms linking African markets to Spanish colonial economies. It provided structure to a trade that might otherwise have remained scattered and unpredictable. By establishing legal frameworks and commercial expectations, the system encouraged more merchants to invest in long-distance voyages. The Asiento also reflected the broader economic logic of the Atlantic world. European states increasingly relied on private commercial partnerships to expand overseas trade. Instead of sending government fleets for every transaction, monarchies granted licenses and privileges to merchants willing to take financial risks. In return, the state collected taxes and benefited from the growth of commerce. During the late 16th century, Spanish colonies continued to grow in both population and economic activity. Sugar plantations expanded across Caribbean islands, while tobacco cultivation spread through several regions. These crops became valuable exports to European markets, and colonial producers required reliable labour forces to maintain production. The steady arrival of enslaved Africans under the Asiento contracts helped sustain these agricultural economies. Plantation owners depended on the system to supply workers capable of performing the demanding labour required by plantation agriculture. Without this steady flow of labour, the colonial economy would have struggled to maintain its output. At the same time, the transportation of enslaved people across the Atlantic became more organised and systematic. Ships were increasingly designed or modified to carry large numbers of captives during long ocean voyages. Captains followed established routes that took advantage of prevailing winds and currents, making transatlantic travel somewhat more predictable. Voyages from the African coast to the Caribbean or mainland American ports often lasted several weeks or months, depending on weather conditions. Ships carried supplies of water, food, and trade goods while also attempting to maintain order during the long crossing. The process required careful planning because a failed voyage could produce heavy financial losses for investors. Once ships reached colonial ports, merchants arranged public sales where plantation owners and local officials could purchase enslaved workers. These markets were held in major port cities where buyers gathered to inspect arriving shipments. Prices varied depending on age, health, and skills attributed to the individuals being sold. Spanish colonial cities such as Cartagena, Veracruz, and Havana gradually developed into important centres of this trade. Their harbours received ships carrying goods from Europe and captives from Africa. Merchants, sailors, and colonial officials filled the streets near the docks as cargo was unloaded and redistributed across the colonies. The presence of enslaved Africans transformed the demographic landscape of these regions. African communities appeared in cities, plantations, and mining settlements. Over time, African cultural traditions blended with indigenous and European influences, shaping the social fabric of colonial societies. Languages mixed, musical traditions evolved, and culinary practices changed as communities adapted to life in the Americas. Although colonial systems imposed strict hierarchies, cultural exchange occurred through daily interaction among diverse populations. Meanwhile, the Atlantic trade network continued to expand. Merchants from England, France, and the Netherlands were becoming increasingly active in overseas commerce. Although Spain attempted to maintain strict control over its colonial trade, rival European powers found ways to participate through legal contracts, smuggling, or private agreements. The Asiento contracts eventually reflected this international competition. At different times, the Spanish crown granted the contract to merchants from various countries depending on political alliances and financial arrangements. These changes demonstrated how the Atlantic slave trade had become a multinational enterprise involving merchants from across Europe. Financial institutions also began to play a larger role in supporting the trade. Investors pooled resources to fund voyages, purchase ships, and acquire cargo. Insurance arrangements developed to protect merchants against the risks of storms or shipwrecks. Banking networks helped move money between ports separated by thousands of miles. The Atlantic economy was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Information about prices, crop yields, and shipping schedules circulated between European cities and colonial markets. Merchants relied on letters and reports to guide their decisions about where to send ships and what cargo to carry. At the centre of this growing system were the forced migrations organised through the Asiento contracts. The legal framework allowed merchants to coordinate voyages that linked African supply zones to American labour markets. Each successful shipment reinforced the economic logic that supported the trade. Over time, the number of enslaved Africans transported through these networks increased steadily. What had begun as relatively small shipments during the early 16th century expanded into a much larger commercial enterprise by the end of the century. The Asiento system therefore represented more than a legal contract. It symbolized the growing integration of Atlantic commerce. European governments, African trading networks, and American plantation economies were becoming connected through shared economic incentives. This interconnected system would continue evolving during the 17th century as new European powers entered the Atlantic trade and colonial agriculture expanded even further. West African kingdoms and coastal trade. By the late 16th century, the Atlantic slave trade was no longer simply a European maritime enterprise. It had become deeply connected to the political landscapes of West and Central Africa. Along thousands of miles of coastline, African kingdoms, trading communities, and local leaders interacted with European merchants through systems that combined diplomacy, commerce, and negotiation. The Atlantic trade did not function independently from African societies. Instead, it operated through existing regional networks that had developed over centuries. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, West Africa already possessed complex political and commercial systems. Powerful states controlled territory, collected taxes, and maintained armies. Trade routes linked interior regions to coastal markets, carrying goods such as gold, salt, ivory, textiles, and agricultural products. Caravans moved through savannas and forests, connecting communities across vast distances. Merchants understood the geography of rivers, seasonal travel conditions, and the shifting alliances between regional rulers. European traders entering this environment found that successful commerce required cooperation with African authorities. Coastal trade could not simply be imposed by force. Ships arriving from Europe depended on the willingness of local rulers to allow trading posts, market access, and safe anchorages. In many places, African leaders controlled the conditions under which foreign merchants could conduct business. These rulers often viewed Atlantic trade as one opportunity among many within their broader economic strategies. Access to European goods, especially metal tools, firearms, textiles, and luxury items, could strengthen political power and improve military capability. Leaders who controlled coastal commerce gained influence over neighbouring territories and could shape regional trade flows. Several African states became important participants in the expanding Atlantic exchange. The Kingdom of Congo, located in Central Africa, maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with Portugal beginning in the late 15th century. Congo's rulers communicated directly with Portuguese authorities through letters and envoys. Some members of the royal family adopted Christianity, and missionaries travelled between the two regions. This relationship combined diplomacy with trade. Congo leaders sought alliances and access to foreign goods, while Portuguese merchants hoped to secure reliable trading partners. However, the increasing demand for enslaved labour in Atlantic colonies gradually placed strain on these relationships. As European merchants sought more captives for export, pressures within regional political systems intensified. Further north along the coast, other trading regions became important centres of Atlantic commerce. The Gold Coast, named for its rich deposits of gold, had long been connected to inland trade routes reaching into the interior of West Africa. Coastal communities in this area managed markets where merchants exchanged gold, ivory, and other commodities. European traders built forts and warehouses along the coast, but the surrounding territories remained under the authority of African rulers. These forts functioned primarily as trading centres rather than large military settlements. Merchants stored goods inside fortified walls while negotiating transactions with African brokers and merchants who travelled to the coast. Local middlemen often played essential roles as interpreters and negotiators between European captains and inland trading networks. The process of acquiring captives for export was complex and varied from place to place. In some cases, captives came from prisoners taken during regional conflicts. In other situations, individuals were enslaved through judicial systems that punished certain crimes with forced labour. Debt arrangements could also lead to forms of bondage, particularly in societies where repayment obligations carried strong legal weight. As Atlantic demand increased, the incentives connected to these systems began to change. Captives who might once have been integrated into local labour systems could now be sold to foreign traders for valuable imported goods. This new economic opportunity altered the balance of regional commerce and sometimes intensified conflicts between neighbouring groups. European merchants did not travel far inland to obtain captives themselves. Instead, they relied on African traders who transported people and goods along established routes toward coastal markets. These traders organised caravans that moved through forests, savannas and river systems linking interior regions to Atlantic ports. At the coast, captives were held in temporary enclosures or trading compounds while negotiations took place. Transactions involved detailed bargaining over prices and quantities. European goods, especially textiles, metal tools, alcohol and firearms, served as the primary items exchanged during these deals. Firearms in particular had significant effects on regional power dynamics. Access to imported weapons could strengthen military forces and alter the balance between rival states. Some rulers sought to control the trade in order to secure advantages over neighbouring territories. As a result, political competition sometimes became closely tied to Atlantic commerce. Meanwhile, European trading companies gradually expanded their presence along the coast. Portuguese merchants had been the earliest participants, but other European powers soon followed. The Dutch, English and French established their own forts and trading stations during the 17th century. Each of these powers hoped to secure a share of the profitable Atlantic markets. Competition between European traders created new opportunities for African rulers. By negotiating with multiple trading partners, some leaders were able to obtain better prices or more favourable exchange terms. In certain regions, coastal authorities carefully balanced relationships with different European nations in order to maintain independence and economic leverage. African merchant networks played an equally important role in shaping the trade. These traders understood regional geography and maintained connections with communities far inland. They organised transportation, gathered goods, and coordinated exchanges with coastal brokers. Without their participation, European merchants would have struggled to access interior markets. Trade centres along the coast gradually developed into busy commercial zones where diverse groups interacted. African merchants, European traders, interpreters, sailors, and local labourers all participated in daily market activity. Languages mixed, currencies were negotiated, and customs evolved to facilitate communication between cultures. The rhythm of Atlantic commerce followed seasonal patterns. Ships from Europe usually arrived during specific months when winds and ocean currents made travel easier. Coastal markets prepared for these arrivals by gathering goods and captives in advance. Once ships appeared offshore, negotiations began quickly to load cargo before favourable winds shifted. European captains aimed to complete transactions efficiently because delays could threaten the success of the voyage. Food supplies, crew wages, and ship maintenance all added to the cost of each expedition. The sooner cargo was secured and the Atlantic crossing began, the greater the chance of profitable return. At the same time, African communities along the coast experienced the growing influence of Atlantic trade in daily life. Imported textiles appeared in local markets. Metal tools changed agricultural practices. Foreign goods became symbols of status and wealth among certain elites. Yet the expansion of the slave trade also introduced instability. As the demand for captives increased, some regions experienced heightened conflict as groups competed for control over trade routes and markets. Political alliances shifted, and populations sometimes moved in response to changing economic pressures. The effects of these developments were uneven across the continent. Some societies maintained limited involvement with Atlantic commerce, focusing instead on inland trade networks. Others became deeply entangled in coastal exchange systems. Geography, political organization, and leadership decisions all shaped how communities interacted with European merchants. Throughout this period, African agency remained central to the functioning of the trade. European ships depended on African markets to supply captives and goods. African rulers controlled access to many coastal regions. Negotiations determined the pace and scale of transactions. Nevertheless, the growing integration of African commerce with Atlantic markets gradually increased the scale of forced migration across the ocean. As plantation economies in the Americas expanded, the number of captives transported through these networks continued to rise. By the early 17th century, the Atlantic system had become a triangular network linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas through continuous maritime movement. European goods moved toward African markets, captives were transported across the Atlantic, and plantation crops travelled back to Europe. West African kingdoms and trading communities stood at the centre of this exchange during its early stages. Their political decisions, commercial networks, and diplomatic strategies shaped how the trade operated along the coast. Over time, however, the growing demand from Atlantic plantations would place increasing strain on these regional systems. The balance between local economic interests and the expanding pressures of global commerce would become more difficult to maintain. The Atlantic slave trade was no longer a small or experimental enterprise. It had grown into a complex system connecting continents through markets, shipping routes, and political alliances. The involvement of West African kingdoms and coastal traders played a crucial role in sustaining that system during its formative centuries. And as the 17th century approached, another stage of the Atlantic world was beginning to emerge, one defined by longer voyages, larger ships, and the increasingly regular crossings that would soon become known as the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage takes shape. As the Atlantic slave trade expanded during the 17th century, the sea journey between Africa and the Americas became an increasingly regular part of Atlantic commerce. This transoceanic crossing, later known as the Middle Passage, formed the central segment of a trading cycle that connected Europe, Africa, and the American colonies. Ships moved in repeated patterns, carrying goods to African markets, transporting captives across the Atlantic, and returning with plantation products destined for European ports. In the early years of Atlantic commerce, voyages transporting enslaved Africans across the ocean were relatively small and irregular. Merchants experimented with routes, cargo capacities, and navigation techniques, while learning how to organize profitable expeditions. As demand for labor in American colonies grew, these voyages gradually became more systematic. Ship captains, investors, and trading companies developed methods to coordinate the movement of ships, crews, and cargo along predictable schedules. The design of ships played an important role in shaping these voyages. Most vessels used in the early slave trade were not originally built specifically for transporting captives. They were general cargo ships, adapted for multiple purposes. However, as the trade increased in scale, merchants began modifying ship interiors to carry larger numbers of people during long ocean crossings. Wooden platforms were constructed below deck to increase the amount of usable space inside the ship's hold. These platforms allowed captives to be confined in narrow areas stacked in tiers. The intention was to maximize the number of individuals transported during each voyage. From the perspective of merchants and ship owners, a successful journey depended on delivering as many captives as possible to colonial markets. Preparing a ship for such a voyage required careful planning. Merchants assembled cargo intended for African markets, including textiles, metal tools, alcohol, and firearms. These goods were loaded before the ship departed Europe. Once the vessel reached the African coast, the cargo would be exchanged through negotiations with local traders and brokers. The time spent along the coast varied, depending on local conditions and the success of negotiations. Captains often anchored near established trading posts or coastal markets, where transactions could be arranged more easily. African traders transported captives from inland regions to these coastal locations, where they were held temporarily, while merchants negotiated prices and quantities. When enough captives had been obtained to fill the ship's hold, preparations for the Atlantic crossing began. Food, water, and basic supplies were loaded to sustain both crew and captives during the voyage. The ship then departed the African coast, heading westward toward the Americas. The Atlantic crossing could take several weeks or months depending on winds, currents, and weather conditions. Sailors relied on established navigation routes that followed prevailing wind systems across the ocean. These routes allowed ships to travel with greater efficiency than earlier exploratory voyages. Conditions during the Middle Passage were extremely difficult. Ships were often crowded, with captives confined in limited spaces below deck. Ventilation was poor, and the movement of the ship created constant instability. Crew members attempted to manage the voyage by organizing routines that included feeding, cleaning, and maintaining order among the captives. Food supplies usually consisted of basic staples such as grains or beans. Water was rationed carefully because shortages could threaten the survival of everyone aboard. Captains needed to calculate provisions precisely before departure to ensure that supplies would last for the entire journey. Disease posed a constant risk during the voyage. The close quarters, limited sanitation, and long periods at sea created conditions where illness could spread quickly. Ship crews also faced health challenges, as sailors often suffered from diseases or injuries during long expeditions. Despite these dangers, merchants continued organizing voyages because the financial incentives remained strong. Plantation owners in the Americas paid high prices for enslaved workers, and successful shipments generated substantial profits for investors. Each voyage involved significant risk, but the potential returns encouraged continued expansion of the trade. Once ships reached the Americas, captives were unloaded and taken to colonial markets. These markets were usually located in major port cities where merchants gathered to purchase laborers for plantations, mines, or domestic service. The sale of captives represented the final stage of the Middle Passage for those transported across the ocean. Colonial buyers inspected individuals and negotiated prices based on factors such as age, health, and perceived physical strength. After purchase, enslaved individuals were transported to plantations or urban households where they began new lives under forced labor systems. For merchants and captains, the journey did not end there. Ships were then loaded with goods produced in the Americas, including sugar, tobacco, cotton, or other crops. These commodities were carried back across the Atlantic toward European markets, completing the triangular pattern of trade. European port cities played important roles in this commercial cycle. Ports such as Lisbon, Seville, Bristol, and Nantes became busy centres where ships were repaired, cargo was unloaded, and new voyages were planned. Merchants met in counting houses to review shipping records, calculate profits, and prepare investments for future expeditions. The financial structure supporting these voyages also became more sophisticated. Investors pooled resources to fund ships and cargo. Insurance agreements were developed to protect against losses caused by storms, piracy, or shipwreck. Banking networks allowed merchants to transfer money between distant cities connected by the Atlantic trade. As the 17th century progressed, European involvement in the slave trade expanded beyond Portugal and Spain. England, France, and the Netherlands established trading companies dedicated to overseas commerce. These companies built forts along the African coast and organized fleets that transported captives to their own colonies in the Americas. The competition between European powers increased the scale of the slave trade. Each nation sought to secure access to profitable plantation economies and the labor forces that supported them. As a result, more ships crossed the Atlantic carrying enslaved Africans toward American markets. The Middle Passage, therefore, became a central feature of the Atlantic world. It represented the physical connection between African supply networks and American plantation economies. Without this sea route, the plantation systems that developed across the Americas would not have been able to function in the same way. At the same time, the repeated movement of ships across the Atlantic created cultural exchanges that reshaped societies on both sides of the ocean. African traditions travelled with enslaved communities into the Americas, influencing music, language, agriculture, and religious practices in many regions. The Atlantic Ocean itself became a shared space where sailors from different countries interacted with merchants, traders, and colonial administrators. Knowledge about navigation, weather patterns, and maritime technology circulated through these encounters. By the late 17th century, the Middle Passage had become an established route travelled by hundreds of ships each year. Captains followed known wind patterns that carried vessels from African coasts toward the Caribbean and American mainland. The regularity of these voyages transformed the Atlantic into one of the most active trade corridors in the early modern world. For European merchants and colonial plantation owners, the Middle Passage represented a logistical link in a profitable economic system. For the millions of Africans transported across the ocean, it marked the beginning of a forced journey that would reshape their lives and the societies they entered. The continued expansion of plantation agriculture ensured that the demand for enslaved labour remained high. As sugar, tobacco, and other crops became staples of European consumption, the Atlantic trade in captives grew alongside them. By the end of the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade had matured into a vast commercial enterprise involving multiple continents and competing empires. Ships crossed the ocean with increasing frequency, connecting distant shores through a system of trade that would continue to evolve in the centuries that followed. Plantations across the Americas. As the 17th century advanced, plantation agriculture expanded across the tropical regions of the Americas. What had begun earlier on smaller Atlantic islands now appeared on a much larger scale in territories controlled by several European empires. Warm climates, long growing seasons, and fertile soils made these regions well suited for crops that European markets valued highly. Among the most important of these crops were sugar, tobacco, indigo, and later cotton. Each of them required careful cultivation and a steady labour force capable of maintaining agricultural production throughout the year. The Caribbean islands became some of the most active centres of plantation development. Spanish settlements had appeared there first, but over time other European powers established colonies as well. England, France, and the Netherlands founded new island colonies that soon adopted plantation agriculture as their primary economic system. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and several other islands became closely associated with sugar cultivation during the 17th and 18th centuries. Sugar plantations operated as large agricultural estates that combined farming with industrial processing. Cane fields stretched across hillsides and lowlands near the coast. When the cane reached maturity, workers harvested it quickly because the sugar content declined once the plant was cut. The stalks were transported to mills where rollers crushed them to extract juice. The juice then moved into boiling houses where it was heated and refined into sugar crystals. These plantations required complex infrastructure. Buildings housed milling machinery and storage facilities. Roads connected fields to mills so harvested cane could be moved efficiently. Warehouses stored finished sugar before it was shipped to Europe. Plantation owners invested heavily in these systems because the value of sugar exports depended on maintaining consistent production. Labour formed the foundation of this entire structure. Plantations required large groups of workers to plant cane, maintain irrigation systems, harvest crops, and operate mills. European settlers rarely supplied enough labour for these tasks. As a result, enslaved Africans became the primary workforce on most Caribbean plantations. Ships transporting enslaved people across the Atlantic delivered thousands of workers to colonial markets each year. Plantation owners purchased them through auctions or direct transactions with merchants. Once purchased, enslaved individuals were assigned to labour groups responsible for specific tasks across the estate. On many plantations, labour was organised through a structured hierarchy. Overseers supervised daily work in the fields, while managers coordinated operations across the estate. Skilled workers such as carpenters, blacksmiths, or mill operators performed specialised tasks essential to maintaining equipment and buildings. The daily rhythm of plantation life followed the agricultural cycle of the sugar crop. During planting seasons, workers cleared fields and prepared soil for new cane shoots. When harvest season arrived, work intensified because cane had to be processed quickly. Mills often operated continuously during these periods to prevent delays in refining the juice. Beyond the Caribbean islands, plantation agriculture also expanded in Portuguese Brazil. The northeastern region of Brazil proved particularly suitable for sugar cultivation. Portuguese settlers established plantations along coastal areas where shipping routes allowed easy transport of goods to European markets. Brazilian plantations resembled those found in the Caribbean, but often occupied larger tracts of land. Plantation complexes included mills, storage buildings, housing areas, and fields that stretched across wide landscapes. The scale of these operations required large numbers of enslaved labourers transported through Atlantic trade networks. Sugar produced in Brazil became one of the most valuable exports of the Portuguese Empire. European consumers purchased increasing quantities each year, and merchants organised fleets of ships to carry the product across the ocean. As profits increased, plantation owners expanded their estates and demanded more workers to maintain production. The plantation economy influenced nearly every aspect of colonial life in these regions. Port cities developed near plantation zones to manage trade and shipping. Merchants, ship captains, and warehouse operators gathered in these ports to coordinate exports. Markets appeared where goods and supplies were exchanged between rural estates and urban centres. Cities such as Havana, Bridgetown, and Salvador became major hubs within the Atlantic economy. Their harbours received ships carrying manufactured goods from Europe and captives from Africa. After loading plantation products, these ships departed for European markets where sugar and tobacco were sold to wholesalers and retailers. The economic success of plantations also encouraged further European migration to the colonies. Investors hoped to establish estates of their own or participate in the profitable trade surrounding plantation agriculture. Land grants and colonial incentives attracted settlers who saw opportunity in these expanding territories. At the same time, enslaved African communities grew rapidly within plantation regions. Individuals transported from different parts of West and Central Africa found themselves living and working alongside others with diverse languages and cultural traditions. Over time, new communities formed that blended elements from multiple African societies. These communities preserved cultural practices through music, storytelling, food preparation, and religious traditions. Agricultural knowledge also played an important role. Many enslaved Africans possessed experience cultivating crops in tropical environments, and their knowledge influenced plantation agriculture in the Americas. The presence of African communities reshaped the cultural landscape of colonial societies. Languages evolved as African words and rhythms blended with European and indigenous influences. Musical traditions developed that combined instruments and melodies from different regions of the world. Culinary practices incorporated ingredients and cooking methods drawn from multiple cultures. Despite the rigid structure of plantation systems, enslaved people created networks of support within their communities. Families formed whenever possible, and elders often passed knowledge to younger generations. These social connections helped individuals navigate the harsh conditions imposed by colonial labour systems. Plantation economies also generated enormous wealth for European merchants and colonial elites. Sugar exports alone produced vast profits, which were reinvested in ships, trading companies, and additional plantations. Financial institutions in Europe supported these ventures through loans, insurance, and investment partnerships. As European demand for plantation crops continued rising, competition between colonial powers intensified. England and France, in particular, invested heavily in their Caribbean colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries. Rival fleets sailed across the Atlantic carrying goods, soldiers, and merchants seeking influence in the region. This competition occasionally led to military conflicts over control of strategic islands. Because sugar plantations produced such valuable exports, European governments viewed Caribbean territories as essential components of their imperial economies. Wars in Europe often extended into the Atlantic as rival nations attempted to capture or defend colonial possessions. Meanwhile, plantation agriculture spread beyond sugar production alone. Tobacco cultivation expanded in several regions, especially in British North American colonies such as Virginia and Maryland. Indigo plantations appeared in parts of the Caribbean and mainland Americas, producing dyes used in European textile manufacturing. Although the specific crops varied from place to place, the plantation model remained largely consistent. Large estates organized agricultural production through forced labor systems supported by Atlantic trade networks. Ships transported workers to plantations and carried finished products back to Europe. By the early 18th century, plantations had become central to the economic life of many Atlantic colonies. Their success reinforced the demand for enslaved labor, which in turn encouraged continued expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. The Americas had become the primary destination for millions of Africans transported across the ocean. Plantation agriculture required a constant supply of workers capable of sustaining production across vast estates. As European markets continued to consume sugar, tobacco, and other plantation crops, the Atlantic system grew even more interconnected. Merchants, planters, and governments relied on this trade to generate wealth and maintain their influence in the global economy. Plantations across the Americas therefore represented one of the most visible outcomes of the Atlantic slave trade. They transformed landscapes, economies, and societies while linking distant continents through an expanding network of commerce and labor. European rivalries and the trade. By the late 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade had grown large enough to attract the sustained attention of nearly every major European maritime power. What had begun earlier under Portuguese and Spanish influence gradually became a field of intense commercial rivalry. Nations that once observed from the margins began building fleets, founding trading companies, and establishing colonial settlements designed to capture a share of the expanding Atlantic economy. England, France, and the Netherlands entered the Atlantic trade during the 17th century with increasing determination. Their merchants recognized that plantation agriculture in the Americas required a steady supply of labor, and the trade in enslaved Africans had become deeply tied to that demand. Governments encouraged commercial ventures by granting charters to trading companies, building naval power, and securing strategic coastal territories. The Dutch were among the earliest challengers to Iberian dominance in Atlantic commerce. During the early 17th century, Dutch merchants and sailors launched campaigns to disrupt Portuguese and Spanish trade networks. Their fleets targeted shipping routes and coastal forts along West Africa and Brazil. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, received authority from the Dutch government to conduct trade and establish colonies across the Atlantic. This company organized fleets that sailed regularly between European ports, African trading regions, and American colonies. Dutch traders seized several Portuguese forts along the African coast during this period, gaining access to established trading centres that had previously been controlled by Portuguese merchants. Although control of these locations shifted over time through warfare and negotiation, the Dutch presence marked a turning point in the competitive landscape of the Atlantic slave trade. England soon followed a similar path. English merchants had long shown interest in overseas trade, but during the 17th century the English crown increasingly supported organised commercial ventures in the Atlantic. One of the most influential organisations created during this period was the Royal African Company, chartered in 1672. The Royal African Company received the exclusive right to trade along portions of the West African coast. Its ships carried European manufactured goods to African markets and returned with captives who were transported across the Atlantic to English colonies. The company also constructed forts and trading posts along the coast to protect its commercial operations. These forts served as warehouses and negotiation centres, where African merchants and European agents arranged exchanges. Captains arriving from England unloaded trade goods and waited while brokers negotiated transactions with inland traders who transported captives to coastal markets. Once ships were loaded, they departed for the Caribbean or North American colonies where plantation owners purchased enslaved workers. France also developed its own system of Atlantic commerce. French colonial expansion in the Caribbean produced several plantation colonies that quickly became economically important. Saint-Domingue, Martinique, and Guadeloupe emerged as major centres of sugar production during the 17th and 18th centuries. French trading companies organised voyages similar to those conducted by English and Dutch merchants. Ships sailed between French ports, African trading centres, and Caribbean plantations in a repeating cycle. These voyages transported both goods and enslaved Africans, while returning with valuable crops destined for European markets. Competition between European powers reshaped the Atlantic slave trade in several ways. First, it increased the number of ships participating in the trade. Each nation attempted to expand its own fleet and strengthen its position in African and American markets. As a result, the volume of transatlantic voyages rose steadily throughout the late 17th and 18th centuries. Second, rivalry encouraged the construction of additional forts and trading posts along the African coast. European powers sought secure bases where ships could anchor safely and conduct negotiations with local merchants. These forts became symbols of national presence as well as practical centres of trade. However, despite their imposing appearance, these structures rarely allowed European powers to dominate inland territories. African rulers maintained authority over surrounding regions and controlled access to many trade routes. European traders remained dependent on cooperation with African merchants and political leaders who managed the movement of goods and captives from the interior. Third, European rivalry encouraged improvements in maritime organisation. Merchants sought ways to make voyages more efficient and profitable than those of their competitors. Shipbuilders refined vessel designs to carry larger cargoes across long distances. Navigation techniques improved as sailors gained experience travelling the Atlantic's wind systems and currents. Financial institutions in Europe also played a growing role during this period. Investors funded expeditions by purchasing shares in trading companies or individual voyages. Insurance markets developed to protect merchants against the risks of storms, piracy, and shipwreck. Banks facilitated payments between ports separated by thousands of miles. European port cities became central nodes in this commercial system. Cities such as Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, Amsterdam, and Lisbon grew increasingly wealthy through their participation in Atlantic trade. Dockyards expanded to accommodate larger fleets of merchant ships. Warehouses stored goods arriving from distant colonies. Merchants met in counting houses to negotiate contracts and track shipments. Liverpool eventually became one of the busiest slave-trading ports in the British Empire. By the 18th century, its merchants financed hundreds of voyages transporting enslaved Africans to plantations across the Caribbean and North America. Shipbuilding industries, financial services, and trading houses flourished as the port expanded. In France, the city of Nantes developed a similar role. French merchants based there organised numerous expeditions to West Africa and the Caribbean. Ships departing Nantes carried textiles, alcohol, and manufactured goods intended for African markets. They returned with plantation products such as sugar, coffee, and indigo that were sold throughout Europe. These port cities were not isolated from the broader economy. Profits from Atlantic commerce flowed into other sectors including banking, manufacturing, and infrastructure development. Textile factories produced goods specifically intended for trade with African markets. Metalworking industries manufactured tools and weapons used in commercial exchanges. Meanwhile, Plantation colonies in the Americas continued expanding their agricultural output. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean became especially profitable during the 18th century. The colony of Saint-Domingue, under French control, eventually grew into one of the largest sugar producers in the world. This rapid growth further increased the demand for enslaved labour. Merchants organised larger fleets to transport workers from Africa to the Americas. The number of captives carried across the Atlantic rose dramatically during this period, making the 18th century the peak era of the transatlantic slave trade. European governments sometimes attempted to regulate the trade through charters or licensing systems. However, competition often undermined these efforts. When one nation attempted to restrict trade to a particular company, merchants from rival countries frequently found ways to enter the market through smuggling or alternative arrangements. Piracy also affected Atlantic commerce during certain periods. Armed ships sometimes attacked merchant vessels travelling between continents. Although pirates targeted many types of cargo, slave ships were occasionally among their victims because of the valuable goods they carried. Naval power, therefore, became an important tool for protecting trade routes. European governments invested in stronger fleets to escort merchant ships and defend colonial territories. Wars between European nations often extended into the Atlantic, where rival fleets attempted to disrupt each other's commerce. Despite these conflicts, the underlying structure of the Atlantic slave trade remained remarkably resilient. As long as plantation agriculture demanded large numbers of workers and European markets consumed plantation crops, merchants continued organising voyages across the ocean. African coastal markets remained essential to this system. European traders negotiated with African brokers and rulers who controlled access to interior trading networks. These relationships allowed captives to be transported from inland regions to coastal ports, where they were sold to waiting ships. By the middle of the 18th century, the Atlantic slave trade had become one of the largest commercial enterprises in the world. Thousands of ships crossed the ocean each decade carrying goods, people, and agricultural products between continents. European rivalries helped drive this expansion by encouraging greater investment, more ships, and increasingly complex trade networks. Each nation sought to strengthen its position within the Atlantic economy, while competing for access to profitable colonial markets. The result was a system that linked European industrial production, African trading networks, and American plantation agriculture into a vast interconnected economy. The Atlantic Ocean had become the central stage for this exchange, with merchant fleets moving continuously between its shores. This rivalry would continue shaping the trade during the 18th century, but new forces were also beginning to emerge. Voices questioning the moral and political consequences of slavery would slowly gain attention in European and American societies. For the moment, however, the commercial momentum of the Atlantic slave trade remained strong, sustained by the powerful economic interests that had grown around it. Port cities of the slave trade. As the Atlantic slave trade expanded during the 17th and 18th centuries, certain port cities grew into major centres of maritime commerce. These ports functioned as the logistical hubs that connected African markets, American plantations, and European consumers. Ships departed from their harbours carrying trade goods, returned with plantation crops, and were refitted for new voyages. The prosperity of these cities became closely tied to the Atlantic trading system, and their waterfronts reflected the constant movement of goods and people across the ocean. Among the most important of these ports were cities such as Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, Lisbon, and Amsterdam. Each of them developed extensive commercial infrastructure to support maritime trade. Dockyards expanded to accommodate growing fleets of merchant ships. Warehouses lined the waterfront to store imported cargo before it was distributed to inland markets. Financial institutions, insurance companies, and trading houses appeared in city centres to coordinate the business of overseas commerce. The daily rhythm of these port cities revolved around the arrival and departure of ships. When a vessel entered the harbour, dockworkers unloaded cargo from its hold while merchants inspected the goods. Sugar, tobacco, coffee, and other plantation products were transferred into warehouses where they awaited sale to wholesalers or export to other regions. These commodities often travelled far beyond the port where they first arrived, reaching markets across Europe. Before departing again, ships were prepared for the next stage of the Atlantic trade cycle. Crews repaired sails, loaded supplies, and secured trade goods intended for African markets. Merchants reviewed cargo manifests and negotiated contracts with investors who financed the voyage. Once preparations were complete, the ships left the harbour and sailed southward toward the African coast. Liverpool became one of the most prominent slave trading ports during the 18th century. Located on the western coast of England, the city benefited from easy access to Atlantic shipping routes. Liverpool merchants invested heavily in the slave trade, organising hundreds of voyages between Africa and the Americas. Shipyards in the city produced vessels designed specifically for long-distance trade, while local industries supplied manufactured goods used in exchanges along the African coast. The profits generated by these voyages contributed to Liverpool's rapid growth. New docks were constructed to handle increasing traffic, and merchants built large houses in the expanding city centre. Banking institutions and insurance companies emerged to support the financial needs of Atlantic commerce. By the late 18th century, Liverpool had become one of Britain's most significant trading ports. Another British port with strong connections to the slave trade was Bristol. During the 17th century, Bristol merchants played a major role in organising voyages to West Africa and the Caribbean. The city's harbour served as a departure point for ships carrying trade goods that would be exchanged for captives. Bristol's merchants developed networks of investors and agents who coordinated the complex logistics of transatlantic voyages. Although Liverpool eventually surpassed Bristol in the volume of slave trading expeditions, Bristol remained an important commercial centre. Goods arriving from Caribbean plantations were unloaded at its docks and transported inland through river and road networks. The wealth generated by this trade influenced the development of the city's infrastructure and commercial institutions. Across the English Channel, Nantes emerged as France's leading slave-trading port. Situated along the Loire River, Nantes had direct access to Atlantic shipping routes and a long tradition of maritime commerce. French merchants based there organised numerous expeditions to West Africa during the 18th century. Ships departing from Nantes carried goods such as textiles, metalware, and alcohol intended for exchange along African trading coasts. When these ships returned from the Americas, they often carried sugar, coffee, and other plantation products grown in French Caribbean colonies. The wealth generated by this commerce transformed Nantes into a prosperous city with elegant architecture and expanding commercial districts. Merchant families invested their profits in shipping companies, urban development, and financial institutions that further strengthened the city's role in Atlantic trade. Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, also played a significant part in the slave trade, particularly during its earlier phases. Portuguese merchants had been among the first Europeans to establish trading connections along the African coast. Lisbon served as the administrative centre where voyages were organised, licences were issued, and cargo was distributed throughout Europe. Ships departing Lisbon carried trade goods toward African markets and often continued onward to Portuguese colonies in Brazil. Brazilian sugar and other plantation crops returned to Lisbon's docks before being redistributed to European buyers. The city's harbour became a gateway connecting Portuguese colonial territories with the broader Atlantic economy. The Netherlands contributed to this network through ports such as Amsterdam and Middelburg. Dutch merchants operated powerful trading companies that participated in Atlantic commerce alongside their activities in Asia. The Dutch West India Company organised voyages linking European markets to African trading regions and American plantations. Amsterdam's financial institutions played a particularly important role in supporting Atlantic trade. Banks, insurers, and investment houses provided capital for shipping ventures and helped merchants manage the financial risks associated with long-distance voyages. These institutions allowed traders to raise funds more easily, which in turn increased the scale of commercial activity across the Atlantic. Port cities did more than simply load and unload cargo. They acted as centres of information where news about distant colonies and markets circulated among merchants. Captains arriving from overseas reported on crop yields, commodity prices, and political developments in the colonies. This information helped traders decide where to send ships and which goods to carry on future voyages. These cities also supported industries that supplied the Atlantic trade. Textile manufacturers produced cloth that merchants exchanged in African markets. Metal workers crafted tools and weapons used in trading transactions. Shipbuilders constructed vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic multiple times during their service lives. The economic influence of Atlantic trade extended far beyond the waterfront. Urban populations grew as labourers, sailors and craftsmen migrated to port cities seeking employment. Markets expanded to serve these growing populations, and new neighbourhoods developed around the docks. Cultural life in these cities reflected the diversity of people connected to maritime commerce. At the same time, the slave trade left visible marks on the urban landscape. Wealthy merchant families financed public buildings, churches, and civic institutions using profits generated from Atlantic commerce. Streets and warehouses bore the names of trading companies and ship captains involved in the trade. African individuals also appeared in European port cities, though in smaller numbers than in the colonies. Some were sailors working aboard merchant ships, while others arrived as servants or labourers connected to trading households. Their presence demonstrated the global reach of the Atlantic system that linked continents through commerce and migration. By the 18th century, the Atlantic slave trade had reached a scale that required extensive logistical coordination. Port authorities recorded the movements of ships entering and leaving the harbour. Customs officials collected taxes on imported goods. Merchants relied on detailed paperwork to track cargoes and financial transactions. Shipping schedules followed seasonal wind patterns that governed Atlantic navigation. Ships departing European ports usually sailed south along the coast before turning west toward Africa. After completing their transactions along the African coast, they crossed the Atlantic toward Caribbean or American ports where captives were sold and plantation goods were loaded. This repeating cycle connected port cities to plantations thousands of miles away. Sugar produced in Caribbean fields eventually appeared in European markets through these ports. Tobacco harvested in American colonies travelled through similar routes before reaching consumers across the continent. The wealth generated by these exchanges strengthened the economic importance of Atlantic port cities. Their docks became symbols of a global trading system that moved goods, capital, and labour across oceans. Merchant fleets sailed continuously between continents, linking distant regions through commerce. However, as the 18th century progressed, new debates about slavery and the slave trade began to emerge within European societies. Religious groups, philosophers, and political activists started questioning the moral foundations of a system that transported millions of people into forced labour. These discussions would gradually influence public opinion and government policies in several countries. While the Atlantic trade remained powerful during the 18th century, the seeds of opposition were beginning to grow in the very societies that had benefited from its expansion. For the moment, however, port cities remained busy centres of maritime activity. Ships continued to depart their harbours bound for African coasts and American plantations, carrying with them the economic ambitions of merchants and empires engaged in one of the largest trading systems of the early modern world, life within the plantation system. By the 18th century, plantation societies had become firmly established across many regions of the Americas. Sugar estates dominated large areas of the Caribbean, while plantations producing tobacco, rice, coffee and other crops appeared in different colonial territories. These estates functioned as agricultural enterprises designed to supply European markets with valuable commodities. Behind the export statistics and shipping records, however, existed daily routines that shaped the lives of the people who worked within the plantation system. Plantations were often organised as self-contained communities. A typical estate included fields, mills or processing facilities, storage buildings, and housing areas for both owners and labourers. The landscape was carefully arranged to support agricultural production. Cane fields stretched across lowlands and hillsides, irrigation channels carried water through cultivated areas, and roads connected different parts of the estate so harvested crops could reach the mills quickly. At the centre of the plantation stood the owner's residence, or administrative building. From there, managers and overseers directed daily operations. Their responsibilities included supervising labour, organising planting and harvest schedules, and maintaining the machinery used to process crops. Plantation owners might live on the estate permanently or spend only part of the year there while travelling between colonies and Europe. Enslaved Africans and their descendants formed the majority of the workforce on most plantations. They were assigned to various labour groups depending on their age, health, and perceived skills. Field workers performed the largest share of agricultural labour. Their tasks included clearing land, planting crops, weeding fields, harvesting produce, and transporting raw materials to processing facilities. Work schedules were often organised around daylight hours and seasonal agricultural cycles. At sunrise, groups of labourers were directed toward the fields where they worked under the supervision of overseers. Planting seasons involved preparing soil and placing young plants in rows across the fields. During harvest periods, the pace of work increased significantly as crops had to be gathered and processed quickly. Sugar plantations, in particular, required continuous activity during harvest seasons. Once cane was cut, it needed to be crushed and refined without delay. Mills operated day and night during these periods. Workers fed cane into heavy rollers that squeezed out juice, which was then transferred to boiling houses where it was heated and processed into sugar crystals. Other plantations produced different crops that followed their own agricultural rhythms. Tobacco farms required careful curing and storage of leaves after harvest. Rice plantations depended on irrigation systems and seasonal flooding of fields. Coffee estates required workers to pick berries from trees growing across hilly landscapes. Within the plantation system, labour was divided into several specialised roles. Some individuals worked as carpenters, blacksmiths, or masons responsible for maintaining buildings and equipment. Others served as drivers who supervised work groups in the fields. Domestic servants worked in kitchens or households connected to the plantation residents. Despite the strict organisation of plantation life, enslaved communities created social structures that helped individuals maintain connections with one another. Families formed whenever possible, though these families could be disrupted by the buying and selling of enslaved people between estates. Parents passed knowledge to their children about survival, agricultural skills, and cultural traditions. Even within the constraints of plantation labour, cultural life continued to develop. Music played an important role in many communities. Rhythms and melodies brought from Africa blended with influences encountered in the Americas. Songs sometimes accompanied work in the fields or marked gatherings during rare moments of rest. Food traditions also reflected this blending of cultures. Enslaved workers often cultivated small garden plots where they grew vegetables and other crops to supplement the rations provided by plantation owners. Cooking methods combined ingredients available in the Americas with techniques carried from African culinary traditions. Religious practices varied widely across plantation societies. Some enslaved individuals adopted forms of Christianity introduced by European colonists, while others maintained spiritual beliefs rooted in African traditions. In many communities, elements of different belief systems combined into new religious practices that reflected the experiences of life in the Americas. Plantations also contained complex hierarchies that shaped relationships among the people living there. Owners and managers occupied the highest positions within colonial society, followed by overseers and skilled workers. Enslaved labourers formed the majority of the population in many plantation regions, particularly in Caribbean colonies where plantations dominated the economy. These social structures influenced daily interactions across the estate. Overseers were responsible for monitoring fieldwork and maintaining discipline. Plantation records often documented production levels, crop yields, and the number of workers assigned to each task. Managers aimed to ensure that agricultural output remained high enough to support profitable exports. Living conditions on plantations varied depending on location, management practices, and the economic fortunes of individual estates. Housing for enslaved workers usually consisted of simple structures located near the fields or processing buildings. These dwellings formed small villages within the plantation landscape, where families gathered after work. Evenings provided limited opportunities for social interaction within these communities. After the day's labour ended, individuals returned to their homes where they prepared meals, cared for children, and shared stories or songs. These moments allowed cultural traditions to be preserved and passed down across generations. Plantation economies depended heavily on the export of crops to European markets. Ships arrived at colonial ports to collect cargo produced on plantations across the surrounding countryside. Sugar, tobacco, coffee, and other commodities were loaded into barrels or crates before being transported across the Atlantic. Port cities near plantation regions therefore played an important role in the system. Merchants arranged shipments and negotiated prices with buyers in Europe. Warehouses stored plantation products while ships prepared for long voyages back across the ocean. The profits generated by plantation exports contributed to the wealth of European trading companies and colonial elites. Investors reinvested these profits in new plantations, ships, and commercial ventures. As a result, plantation agriculture continued expanding throughout the 18th century. At the same time, the scale of the Atlantic slave trade increased to meet the growing demand for labour. Merchants organised voyages that transported large numbers of enslaved Africans to plantations across the Americas. Each arrival added to the population of workers responsible for maintaining agricultural production. Plantation societies therefore developed as complex environments shaped by economic ambition, cultural exchange, and human resilience. Enslaved communities carried traditions from Africa into new landscapes while adapting to the realities of colonial labour systems. These communities played an essential role in sustaining the plantation economies that defined much of the Atlantic world. Through their labour, agricultural knowledge, and cultural contributions, they shaped the social and economic structures of the colonies in which they lived. By the late 18th century, plantations across the Americas had become central to global commerce. Their products travelled across oceans to reach consumers thousands of miles away. Yet within the fields and villages of these estates, daily life continued according to routines shaped by work, family, and community. While plantation systems appeared stable on the surface, tensions were gradually building within these societies. Resistance, rebellion, and efforts to challenge the conditions of slavery would increasingly emerge as enslaved communities sought ways to reshape their circumstances. These developments would soon become a powerful force within the Atlantic world, influencing both colonial societies and the broader debates about slavery that were beginning to spread across Europe and the Americas. Resistance and rebellion. As plantation societies expanded across the Americas during the 18th century, enslaved communities developed many ways to respond to the conditions imposed by slavery. Plantation systems were designed to maintain strict control over labour and movement, yet the daily realities of life within those systems also created spaces where resistance could emerge. Resistance did not always take the form of large uprisings. Often it appeared through smaller actions, quiet forms of opposition, or efforts to maintain independence in difficult circumstances. One of the most common forms of resistance involved slowing the pace of work. Plantation labour depended on steady productivity, especially during critical agricultural periods such as planting or harvesting. Workers sometimes disrupted this routine by working more slowly, damaging tools, or creating delays in the production process. These actions could affect the efficiency of plantation operations without immediately drawing attention. Another form of resistance involved maintaining cultural traditions that plantation authorities often attempted to suppress. Enslaved communities preserved languages, songs, religious practices, and storytelling traditions that had travelled across the Atlantic from African societies. These traditions strengthened social bonds and helped individuals maintain a sense of identity in unfamiliar environments. Communication networks within enslaved communities also played an important role in resistance. Information about plantation conditions, movements of overseers, and opportunities for escape could spread quietly through conversations, gatherings, or shared labour tasks. These networks allowed individuals to coordinate actions or support one another in difficult situations. Escape represented another significant form of resistance. Some enslaved individuals attempted to leave plantations and seek freedom in remote areas beyond the reach of colonial authorities. These escapees sometimes formed independent communities known as maroon settlements. Maroon communities appeared in several regions across the Americas, including Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, and parts of Central America. Maroon settlements were often located in mountainous terrain, forests, or swamps where access was difficult for colonial forces. These locations provided natural protection and allowed escaped individuals to establish communities that could sustain themselves through agriculture, hunting, and trade with nearby populations. Some maroon groups remained small and mobile, while others developed into larger settlements with organized leadership structures. In Jamaica, maroon communities formed during the 17th century and maintained independence for many decades. Their knowledge of the island's mountainous interior allowed them to resist colonial military expeditions sent to capture them. Over time, negotiations between maroon leaders and colonial authorities led to agreements that recognized the autonomy of certain settlements in exchange for peace. Similar communities appeared in other regions where geography offered opportunities for refuge. In Brazil, groups of escaped individuals established settlements deep in forested areas. Some of these communities survived for years by cultivating crops and defending their territory against colonial patrols. Not all resistance occurred through escape or independent settlements. Within plantations themselves, enslaved communities sometimes organized uprisings aimed at challenging plantation authority. These uprisings varied in scale and outcome. Some involved small groups attempting to seize control of a plantation or escape collectively, while others developed into larger rebellions that affected entire regions. Organizing such uprisings required careful planning and communication. Participants often waited for moments when plantation supervision was limited, such as during festivals or nighttime gatherings. Even so, these efforts carried enormous risks because colonial authorities responded quickly and forcefully to any signs of rebellion. The fear of uprisings shaped the way plantation societies operated. Colonial governments created systems designed to monitor enslaved populations and prevent large-scale revolts. Patrols moved through plantation regions searching for signs of resistance. Laws restricted gatherings and limited movement between estates. Despite these controls, acts of resistance continued throughout the Atlantic world. Enslaved communities remained active participants in shaping their own lives, even under conditions designed to limit their freedom. Their actions demonstrated the persistence of human determination within a system built on forced labor. Religion sometimes played a role in organizing resistance as well. Spiritual leaders within enslaved communities provided guidance and encouragement to those seeking change. Religious gatherings created opportunities for communication and solidarity, helping communities maintain shared beliefs and collective identity. In some colonies, free black communities also emerged alongside enslaved populations. These individuals might have gained freedom through manumission, military service, or other arrangements. Free communities often lived in towns or rural settlements where they worked as artisans, traders, or laborers. Although their legal status differed from that of enslaved workers, they remained part of societies shaped by the broader structure of slavery. The presence of free black communities influenced resistance movements in several ways. They sometimes offered support to escaped individuals or helped transmit information between plantations and maroon settlements. In other cases, they formed networks that allowed people to share resources and knowledge about opportunities for greater independence. European colonial authorities recognized the potential threat posed by organized resistance. Governments introduced laws intended to discourage uprisings and reinforce plantation discipline. These laws regulated daily life in plantation regions, establishing rules governing labor, punishment, and movement. Colonial militias were also created to respond quickly to disturbances. These militias consisted of settlers trained to protect plantations and maintain order within the colony. During periods of unrest, militia forces were mobilized to suppress revolts or capture individuals attempting to escape. Despite these efforts, resistance remained a persistent feature of plantation societies. Enslaved individuals continually searched for ways to improve their circumstances, protect their families, or challenge the authority of plantation systems. Their actions influenced the development of colonial policies and shaped the historical narrative of the Atlantic world. These forms of resistance also contributed to broader discussions about slavery that were beginning to emerge in Europe and the Americas during the late 18th century. Reports of revolts and maroon communities reached European audiences through newspapers, letters, and political debates. Some observers began questioning whether plantation societies could remain stable in the long term. Meanwhile, economic pressures and political changes across the Atlantic were creating new conditions that would soon transform colonial societies. Revolutionary movements in North America and France introduced ideas about liberty and political rights that circulated widely through Atlantic communities. Within this changing environment, resistance within plantation societies would soon intersect with larger political upheavals. The most dramatic example of this transformation would occur in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where a massive uprising would reshape the entire Atlantic world. The Haitian Revolution, which began at the end of the 18th century, would challenge the foundations of slavery and colonial rule in ways that few European leaders had anticipated. Its consequences would reach far beyond the Caribbean, influencing debates about slavery, freedom, and political power throughout the Atlantic. The Haitian Revolution shocks the Atlantic. By the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue had become one of the most productive plantation economies in the Atlantic world. Located on the western portion of the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean Sea, the colony produced enormous quantities of sugar, coffee, and other crops destined for European markets. Its plantations supplied a significant portion of the sugar consumed in Europe and helped make France one of the wealthiest colonial powers of the era. Saint-Domingue's prosperity relied heavily on enslaved labour. Hundreds of plantations operated across the colony's fertile plains and mountain valleys. Large numbers of enslaved Africans worked in fields, mills, and processing houses that supported the export economy. The population of the colony reflected the imbalance created by plantation agriculture. Enslaved people made up the overwhelming majority of the inhabitants, while a much smaller number of European settlers controlled the land and commercial operations. Alongside these groups lived a growing population of free people of African descent. Many had gained their freedom through manumission or had been born free within the colony. Some members of this community owned property or worked as artisans, merchants, and skilled labourers. Despite their economic contributions, colonial laws restricted their political rights and social status. The social structure of Saint-Domingue, therefore, contains several layers shaped by race, wealth, and legal status. European planters and officials occupied the highest positions in the colonial hierarchy. Free people of colour formed an intermediate group whose rights were limited by colonial law. Enslaved Africans and their descendants made up the majority of the population and performed the labour that sustained plantation production. This complex social arrangement existed during a period of profound political change in the Atlantic world. In 1789, the French Revolution began in Europe, challenging traditional systems of monarchy and social hierarchy. Revolutionary ideas about liberty, citizenship, and political representation spread through newspapers, pamphlets, and travellers moving between France and its colonies. In Saint-Domingue, these ideas interacted with existing tensions within colonial society. Free people of colour began demanding greater rights and recognition as citizens of the French Empire. Plantation owners debated how revolutionary policies might affect colonial governance. Meanwhile, enslaved communities listened carefully to news about political developments occurring across the Atlantic. During the summer of 1791, a large uprising began among enslaved workers in the northern region of the colony. Groups of enslaved individuals organised coordinated attacks on plantations and colonial infrastructure. Fields were burned, buildings were destroyed, and plantation operations were disrupted across wide areas. The uprisings spread rapidly as enslaved communities joined the rebellion in different regions. Within weeks, large sections of the colony's plantation system had collapsed. Plantation owners fled their estates, and colonial authorities struggled to regain control over the countryside. Several leaders emerged within the uprising, organising groups of fighters and coordinating strategies for resistance. Among the most influential figures was Toussaint Louverture, a former enslaved man who possessed both military skill and political insight. Louverture gradually became one of the central leaders of the revolutionary movement. The conflict in Saint-Domingue soon developed into a complex struggle involving multiple factions. Enslaved rebels fought to secure their freedom and reshape the colony's political structure. Free people of colour sought equality and representation within the French Empire. European settlers attempted to defend their plantations and maintain colonial authority. International forces also became involved. Spain and Britain, both rivals of France, saw an opportunity to weaken French power in the Caribbean. Their armies entered the conflict at different stages, supporting various factions in hopes of gaining control over the valuable colony. Within France itself, revolutionary politics continued evolving. In 1794, the French government officially abolished slavery in its colonies. This decision transformed the conflict in Saint-Domingue by aligning the revolutionary government with the cause of emancipation. Toussaint Louverture and other leaders joined forces with French revolutionary authorities to resist foreign invasion and stabilize the colony. Over time, Louverture consolidated political and military control across much of the territory. Plantation agriculture resumed in certain regions, but now under systems that no longer relied on formal slavery. By the end of the 18th century, Saint-Domingue had undergone a profound transformation. The rebellion that began in 1791 had dismantled one of the largest plantation systems in the Atlantic world. European observers watched the events closely, recognizing that the revolution represented a major shift in the political and social landscape of the Caribbean. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had risen to power in France, attempted to reassert French authority over the colony. He sent a large military expedition to regain control and restore the plantation economy. However, resistance within the colony continued under leaders such as Jean-Jacques Dessalines and other revolutionary commanders. After years of intense conflict, the French expedition failed to secure lasting control. In 1804, the former colony declared independence and established the nation of Haiti. This event marked the first successful revolution led by formerly enslaved people in the modern Atlantic world. The creation of Haiti had a profound impact across the Americas and Europe. Plantation owners in other colonies viewed the revolution with alarm, fearing that similar uprisings might occur elsewhere. Colonial governments increased surveillance and military patrols in plantation regions to prevent rebellion. At the same time, the Haitian Revolution influenced political debates about slavery. Abolitionist groups in Europe and North America pointed to the events in Saint-Domingue as evidence that the institution of slavery was unstable and morally indefensible. The revolution demonstrated that enslaved communities could organize powerful resistance against plantation systems. Economic consequences also followed the revolution. The collapse of Saint-Domingue's plantation economy disrupted global sugar markets. Other Caribbean colonies attempted to increase production to fill the gap left by the former French colony. Meanwhile, the independent nation of Haiti began developing its own political and economic institutions. The country faced significant challenges, including diplomatic isolation and economic pressures from European powers that had relied on plantation exports. Despite these obstacles, Haiti's independence represented a major turning point in Atlantic history. The revolution reshaped ideas about freedom, citizenship, and political authority across the region. It also showed that enslaved communities were capable of transforming the societies in which they lived. For the Atlantic slave trade, the revolution introduced uncertainty into a system that had once appeared firmly established. Plantation owners and merchants realized that resistance within enslaved communities could disrupt even the most profitable colonial economies. At the same time, debates about slavery were growing stronger in several European countries. Religious leaders, writers, and political activists began organizing campaigns calling for the abolition of the slave trade. These movements would soon influence government policies and reshape the future of Atlantic commerce. The Haitian Revolution, therefore, stands as one of the most significant events in the history of the Atlantic world. It revealed the tensions embedded within plantation societies and demonstrated the power of organized resistance. As the 19th century approached, the Atlantic slave trade faced increasing challenges from both political reform movements and changing economic conditions. The system that had expanded so rapidly during the previous centuries was beginning to encounter forces that would gradually lead to its decline. The rise of abolition movements. As the 18th century drew toward its close, the Atlantic slave trade remained one of the largest commercial systems in the world. Ships still moved between European ports, African trading regions, and American plantations. Sugar, tobacco, coffee, and cotton continued to flow into European markets, while merchants organized voyages to supply plantation owners with enslaved labor. Yet during this same period, new ideas and movements were beginning to challenge the foundations of the trade. The growth of abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas did not occur suddenly. It developed gradually through religious reflection, philosophical debate, and political activism. Writers, clergy members, and reformers began questioning whether the slave trade and the institution of slavery could be justified in societies that increasingly spoke about liberty, natural rights, and human dignity. One of the earliest organized groups to oppose the slave trade emerged within the Religious Society of Friends, often known as the Quakers. During the 17th and 18th centuries, many Quaker communities in Britain and North America began debating the moral implications of slavery. Their religious beliefs emphasized equality and the inner value of every person, leading several members to argue that enslaving others conflicted with their spiritual principles. By the mid-18th century, some Quaker leaders had started campaigning openly against both slavery and the transatlantic trade that supplied plantation labor. They circulated pamphlets, organized meetings, and petitioned political authorities to reconsider laws supporting the trade. Although these early campaigns reached only limited audiences at first, they helped introduce abolitionist ideas into broader public discussions. Meanwhile, the Age of Enlightenment encouraged intellectual debate across Europe and the Atlantic world. Philosophers and writers discussed concepts such as natural rights, political representation, and individual liberty. These ideas appeared in books, essays, and political speeches that circulated widely among educated audiences. Some Enlightenment thinkers began examining slavery through the lens of these new principles. They asked whether societies that valued freedom and reason could maintain systems built on forced labor and human ownership. While not all philosophers agreed on the issue, the debate itself helped bring attention to the contradictions between ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery in colonial economies. Printed materials played an important role in spreading these discussions. Newspapers, pamphlets, and books allowed reformers to reach audiences far beyond their local communities. Accounts written by travelers, missionaries, and former enslaved individuals described the conditions of plantation labor and the experiences of people transported through the slave trade. These writings sometimes included personal narratives that revealed the human consequences of the Atlantic system. Readers in Europe encountered descriptions of ocean voyages, plantation work, and the separation of families. Such accounts encouraged sympathy among some audiences and strengthened the arguments of abolitionist campaigners. During the late 18th century, organized abolition societies began appearing in several countries. In Britain, activists founded groups dedicated specifically to ending the slave trade. These societies gathered evidence about the trade, organised public meetings, and petitioned Parliament to pass laws restricting or abolishing the practice. A prominent figure in the British movement was William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament who worked closely with abolitionist organisations. Wilberforce and his allies presented speeches and petitions to the British government calling for legislation that would end British participation in the transatlantic slave trade. Abolitionist campaigners also developed innovative strategies to influence public opinion. They distributed pamphlets explaining how the slave trade operated and why it should be abolished. Public lectures and debates attracted audiences in towns and cities throughout Britain. One particularly influential campaign involved the widespread distribution of diagrams showing the interior layout of slave ships. These illustrations revealed how captives were confined within the holds of vessels during the Middle Passage. The images circulated through newspapers and pamphlets, helping audiences visualize conditions that had previously remained distant and abstract. Women also played important roles within the abolition movement. Although they often lacked formal political power during this period, women organized fundraising efforts, circulated petitions, and promoted boycotts of goods produced by enslaved labor. In Britain and North America, households sometimes avoided purchasing sugar grown on plantations as a symbolic protest against slavery. Across the Atlantic, similar debates emerged in the newly independent United States. After the American Revolution, discussions about freedom and political rights influenced attitudes towards slavery. Some northern states gradually introduced laws ending slavery within their borders, while southern plantation economies remained heavily dependent on enslaved labor. Free black communities also contributed to abolitionist efforts. Writers, ministers, and activists of African descent spoke publicly about the injustice of slavery and encouraged political reform. Their voices brought personal experience and moral authority to the debate. In France, discussions about slavery intensified during the years of the French Revolution. Revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality raised questions about colonial systems that depended on forced labor. Abolitionist societies appeared in Paris and other cities, advocating reforms that would transform French colonial policy. The Haitian Revolution added further urgency to these discussions. News of the uprising in Saint-Domingue demonstrated that enslaved communities could challenge colonial authority on a massive scale. European observers began reconsidering whether plantation societies built on slavery could remain stable indefinitely. Economic arguments also entered the debate. Some critics of the slave trade suggested that wage labor and free agriculture might prove more efficient in the long term. Others pointed out the costs associated with maintaining systems of forced labor, including military expenses required to suppress rebellions and enforce plantation discipline. At the same time, supporters of the slave trade continued defending the institution on economic grounds. Plantation owners and merchants argued that the Atlantic trade supported thousands of jobs in shipping, manufacturing, and colonial agriculture. They warned that abolishing the trade might disrupt economies dependent on plantation exports. These competing arguments produced intense political debates within European governments. Abolitionists organized petitions and public campaigns urging lawmakers to end the slave trade. Merchants and colonial interests lobbied governments to maintain the system that had generated profits for generations. Gradually, abolitionist movements gained momentum. In Britain, years of campaigning eventually persuaded Parliament to pass the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which made it illegal for British ships to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. The law represented one of the first major victories for abolitionist reformers. The British decision influenced policies in other countries as well. Some European governments began considering similar legislation, though enforcement remained uneven during the early years of abolition. Smuggling and illegal trading continued in certain regions despite official bans. Nevertheless, the passage of abolition laws marked an important turning point in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. For the first time, powerful governments had begun dismantling a system that had dominated global commerce for centuries. The abolition movement did not immediately end slavery itself. Plantation labor systems continued operating in many parts of the Americas for several decades after the slave trade was outlawed. However, the campaign against the trade demonstrated that organized public movements could influence government policy and challenge established economic institutions. The ideas promoted by abolitionists would continue shaping political debates throughout the 19th century. Discussions about freedom, citizenship, and human rights expanded as societies reconsidered the moral and economic foundations of slavery. Britain outlaws the slave trade. By the early years of the 19th century, the long campaign against the Atlantic slave trade had reached a decisive stage. For several decades, reformers in Britain had worked steadily to persuade Parliament that the trade should be abolished. Their efforts involved public meetings, printed pamphlets, petitions, and speeches delivered within the halls of government. Gradually, the movement attracted support from a broad range of individuals, including religious leaders, writers, merchants who had turned against the trade, and political figures willing to champion the cause. The debate in Britain unfolded within a society that had grown deeply connected to Atlantic commerce. British ships had transported large numbers of enslaved Africans to plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. Port cities such as Liverpool and Bristol had built thriving industries around shipping, trade goods, and colonial imports. For many merchants and investors, the slave trade represented a familiar and profitable component of the broader imperial economy. Abolitionists understood that challenging the trade required convincing both political leaders and the general public that the system was morally unacceptable and politically unnecessary. They therefore focused on gathering evidence about how the trade operated. Testimonies from sailors, merchants, and former captives were presented to parliamentary committees investigating the issue. These investigations produced detailed reports describing the conditions aboard slave ships and the structure of the Atlantic trade. Lawmakers examined diagrams of ship layouts, shipping records, and witness accounts describing the long voyages between Africa and the Americas. The evidence presented during these hearings helped shape public opinion and strengthened the arguments of abolitionist reformers. One of the most persistent voices in Parliament was William Wilberforce, who introduced repeated proposals calling for the abolition of the slave trade. Wilberforce worked closely with a network of activists that included writers, clergy members, and political allies who organised campaigns across Britain. Although early proposals to abolish the trade failed to gain enough votes, the movement continued gathering support. Outside Parliament, abolitionists encouraged the public to participate in the campaign through petitions. Thousands of individuals signed documents urging lawmakers to end Britain's involvement in the slave trade. These petitions were delivered to Parliament, demonstrating that opposition to the trade had spread beyond a small circle of reformers. Consumer activism also played a role. Some citizens chose to avoid purchasing sugar produced on plantations that relied on enslaved labour. By reducing demand for plantation goods, they hoped to weaken the economic foundations of the slave trade. Although such boycotts affected only a portion of the market, they symbolized growing awareness among consumers about the origins of the products they used. Political conditions also contributed to the success of abolitionist campaigns. Britain was engaged in conflicts with France during the Napoleonic Wars, and government leaders were eager to demonstrate moral leadership within the international community. Ending the slave trade allowed Britain to present itself as a nation promoting humanitarian reforms. After years of debate and lobbying, the British Parliament finally passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807. This legislation made it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. It also prohibited British merchants from participating in the trade through foreign vessels. The law represented a significant turning point, because Britain had been one of the largest participants in the Atlantic slave trade during the previous century. The passage of the Act did not immediately end the transatlantic trade altogether. Other countries still allowed slave trading, and illegal operations continued in certain regions. However, Britain's decision altered the political landscape of the Atlantic world. The British government now committed its naval power to enforcing the new law. The Royal Navy began patrolling sections of the West African coast and Atlantic shipping routes in an effort to intercept vessels engaged in illegal slave trading. Naval squadrons were stationed in strategic areas where slave ships were known to operate. When British patrol ships encountered suspected slave vessels, they inspected the ships and sometimes seized them if evidence of illegal activity was found. Captured ships were often taken to special courts established to handle cases involving slave trading. These courts examined the circumstances of each capture and determined whether the vessel had violated abolition laws. If a ship was found guilty of slave trading, its cargo was confiscated and the ship itself might be condemned. The naval patrols required extensive resources and coordination. ships needed crews, supplies, and accurate information about trading routes. Patrols covered large stretches of ocean where slave traders sometimes attempted to avoid detection by altering their sailing patterns or using remote coastal landing points. Despite these challenges, the British Navy gradually disrupted many slave trading operations. Some merchants abandoned the trade because the risk of capture increased. Others attempted to continue their voyages secretly, sailing under foreign flags or using concealed cargo holds to avoid inspection. Britain also used diplomatic pressure to encourage other countries to adopt similar policies. Treaties were negotiated with several European powers that agreed to restrict or abolish their participation in the slave trade. These agreements aimed to reduce the number of nations legally involved in transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the effects of the abolition law were felt across British colonies in the Caribbean. Plantation owners could no longer legally import new enslaved workers from Africa. Instead, they relied on the labour force already present within the colonies. This shift gradually changed the demographic structure of plantation societies. For enslaved communities, the abolition of the slave trade marked an important milestone, even though slavery itself remained legal in many places. The ending of transatlantic shipments meant that fewer individuals would be forced across the ocean to work on plantations. At the same time, debates about the future of slavery continued within British political circles. Some abolitionists believed that ending the trade would eventually lead to the complete abolition of slavery. Others argued that additional reforms were necessary to transform colonial labour systems. These discussions would continue for several decades as Britain considered further changes to its colonial policies. The influence of Britain's abolition law extended beyond its own empire. Other nations observed the shift in British policy and began reconsidering their own involvement in the slave trade. Although enforcement varied widely between countries, the international climate surrounding the trade had begun to change. During the early 19th century, Atlantic commerce itself was also evolving. Industrialization in parts of Europe introduced new economic priorities that reshaped global trade patterns. While plantation agriculture remained important, new industries and markets gradually emerged. Nevertheless, the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 represented a clear moment when a powerful government turned against a system that had once been central to its economic activity. The law demonstrated that organised political campaigns could influence national policy and reshape international trade practices. The end of Britain's participation in the slave trade did not immediately dismantle the plantation economies of the Americas. Slavery continued in many regions, and illegal trading persisted in certain areas. Yet the momentum of abolitionist movements was growing, and the long history of the Atlantic slave trade was entering its final chapters. Patrols, blockades, and illegal trade. After Britain outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, the Atlantic world did not change overnight. The trade had operated for centuries and had become deeply connected to plantation economies, shipping networks, and international commerce. Laws alone could not immediately dismantle a system that stretched across 3 continents. Instead, the following decades became a period of enforcement, adaptation, and gradual decline as governments attempted to suppress slave trading, while merchants in some regions continued seeking ways to evade the new restrictions. The British government understood that passing legislation would not be enough. If slave traders could continue sailing freely across the Atlantic, the new law would remain largely symbolic. For that reason, Britain turned to its naval power to enforce abolition. The Royal Navy created a dedicated force known as the West Africa Squadron, whose purpose was to patrol the African coastline and intercept ships suspected of participating in illegal slave trading. These patrols began during the early 19th century and gradually expanded over time. Naval vessels were stationed along important sections of the West African coast, where slave ships commonly gathered cargo before crossing the Atlantic. The squadron also monitored shipping routes in the open ocean, searching for vessels that might be transporting captives in secret. British naval captains received authority to board suspicious ships and inspect their cargo. If evidence of slave trading was discovered, such as the presence of captives, shackles, or specialized ship equipment used for transporting enslaved people, the vessel could be seized. Captured ships were then escorted to designated ports where courts determined whether the vessel had violated abolition laws. To support this enforcement system, Britain negotiated treaties with several European nations. These agreements granted British naval officers the right to inspect ships flying the flags of participating countries if they were suspected of engaging in the slave trade. Mixed courts were also established in certain colonial ports where judges from different countries examined captured vessels and ruled on their legality. One such location was Freetown in Sierra Leone. The British had established Sierra Leone earlier as a settlement for freed Africans and black loyalists who had supported Britain during the American Revolution. During the 19th century, the colony also became a central base for naval patrols against slave traders. When slave ships were captured by the West Africa Squadron, the people aboard were often brought to Sierra Leone. There they were classified as liberated Africans. Many settled in the colony, forming communities that blended cultural traditions from various regions of West and Central Africa. Over time, these communities helped shape the cultural identity of Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown. Despite these enforcement efforts, illegal slave trading continued in several regions during the early 19th century. Some merchants adapted their operations to avoid naval patrols. Ships used faster designs capable of outrunning naval vessels. Traders sometimes loaded captives quickly and departed the African coast before patrol ships could arrive. Other traders attempted to disguise their activities. Ships might sail under the flag of a country that had not yet outlawed the trade, making it more difficult for naval officers to intervene legally. Some captains removed visible equipment associated with slave trading until after they had cleared inspection points. The geography of the Atlantic also made enforcement challenging. The coastline of West Africa stretched for thousands of miles, and naval patrols could not monitor every inlet or harbour at all times. Slave traders sometimes moved their operations to remote areas where enforcement was weaker. From these locations, they could still transport captives across the ocean if they avoided major shipping routes. Meanwhile, certain countries continued allowing slave trading for longer periods. Portugal and Spain remained involved in the trade during parts of the early 19th century, particularly in connection with plantation economies in Brazil and Cuba. As a result, ships operating under these national flags sometimes continued transporting captives even after Britain had outlawed the trade. Brazil became one of the main destinations for enslaved Africans during this period. Portuguese colonial agriculture in Brazil depended heavily on plantation labour, especially in sugar and coffee production. Brazilian merchants therefore maintained trading connections with African markets despite increasing international pressure to end the practice. Cuba also emerged as a major centre of plantation agriculture during the 19th century. Sugar plantations on the island expanded rapidly, creating strong demand for labour. Traders continued importing enslaved Africans to support this growing industry, often operating through illegal or semi-legal arrangements that avoided direct enforcement. The persistence of illegal slave trading demonstrated how difficult it was to dismantle an economic system that had developed over centuries. Even as abolition laws spread across Europe and the Americas, financial incentives encouraged some merchants to continue participating in the trade. Nevertheless, the combined efforts of naval patrols, diplomatic pressure, and international agreements gradually reduced the number of slave trading voyages. By intercepting ships and confiscating cargo, naval patrols increased the risks associated with the trade. Merchants faced the possibility of losing both their vessels and their investments if they were captured. Over time, additional countries passed laws banning the slave trade. The United States outlawed participation in the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, the same year Britain's law took effect. Other European nations followed with similar legislation during the early 19th century. Each new law narrowed the legal space within which slave traders could operate. Diplomatic pressure also intensified. Britain used its influence to encourage other nations to sign treaties committing them to abolition. Some governments agreed to cooperate with British naval patrols or to establish their own enforcement systems along Atlantic routes. The gradual reduction of the transatlantic slave trade did not immediately end slavery itself. Plantation systems continued operating in many regions, relying on enslaved populations already present in the colonies. In the United States, Brazil, Cuba, and several Caribbean islands, slavery remained a central part of agricultural production throughout much of the 19th century. However, the interruption of the Atlantic supply of enslaved labour began to alter the long-term dynamics of plantation economies. Without the ability to import new workers easily, plantation owners increasingly depended on the natural growth of enslaved populations or on internal slave markets within their territories. Meanwhile, global economic conditions were also evolving. Industrialization in Europe created new forms of labour demand and altered patterns of international trade. While plantation crops continued to play important roles in global commerce, economic systems were gradually diversifying beyond the agricultural foundations that had dominated earlier centuries. By the mid-19th century, the transatlantic slave trade had declined significantly compared with its peak during the 18th century. Naval patrols, legal reforms, and diplomatic agreements had made large-scale operations increasingly difficult to sustain. Although illegal voyages still occurred in some areas, the overall system that had once transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic was steadily weakening. The long maritime routes that had defined the Middle Passage were becoming less central to global commerce. The Atlantic slave trade had shaped the history of 3 continents, connecting distant societies through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. Yet the forces of reform, political change, and international cooperation were gradually dismantling the structures that had sustained this system for centuries. In the years that followed, attention would increasingly turn toward the institution of slavery itself. As abolitionist movements continued growing stronger, governments and societies would confront the question of whether forced labour could continue in a world where the trade supplying it had already begun to disappear. The end of the Atlantic slavery era. By the middle of the 19th century, the Atlantic world was entering a period of profound transition. For more than 3 centuries, the movement of enslaved Africans across the ocean had shaped economies, societies, and political relationships between continents. Plantation agriculture in the Americas had depended heavily on that system, while European port cities and trading networks had grown wealthy from the commerce surrounding it. Yet by this time, the transatlantic slave trade had already been weakened by abolition laws, naval patrols, and changing political attitudes. What remained was the institution of slavery itself, still operating within several countries that relied on forced labour to maintain agricultural production. Across the Atlantic world, debates about slavery had become increasingly prominent. Reformers, religious leaders, and political activists continued arguing that slavery contradicted the principles of liberty and justice that many societies claimed to value. Their campaigns gradually influenced government policies and public opinion. At the same time, enslaved communities themselves continued pressing for freedom through resistance, negotiation, and participation in broader social movements. One of the earliest major steps toward ending slavery occurred within the British Empire. After abolishing the slave trade in 1807, British reformers spent more than 2 decades campaigning for the complete abolition of slavery in British colonies. Their efforts eventually led to the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. This legislation declared that enslaved individuals within most British colonial territories would be legally freed. The law introduced a transitional system known as apprenticeship, which required formerly enslaved workers to continue labouring for plantation owners for a limited period before receiving full freedom. Although the system was controversial and faced criticism, it represented a major step toward dismantling plantation slavery within the British Empire. By the late 1830s, apprenticeship was abandoned, and formerly enslaved individuals gained greater legal independence. The abolition of slavery within British colonies influenced debates in other parts of the world. Reformers pointed to Britain's decision as evidence that large empires could transform their labour systems without collapsing economically. political leaders in other countries began reconsidering their own policies regarding slavery. In France, the institution of slavery experienced several shifts during the 19th century. The French Revolution had briefly abolished slavery in 1794, but Napoleon later restored it in certain colonies. After further debate and political change, France permanently abolished slavery across its colonial territories in 1848. This decision ended plantation slavery within French Caribbean colonies and marked another major turning point in Atlantic history. While European empires were dismantling slavery within their colonies, the institution remained firmly established in parts of the Americas. In the United States, slavery had expanded during the early 19th century as cotton plantations spread across the southern states. Cotton became one of the most valuable export crops in global markets, and plantation owners relied heavily on enslaved labor to cultivate it. The growing importance of cotton intensified political divisions within the United States. Northern states had gradually abolished slavery, while southern plantation economies depended on it for agricultural production. Debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories created deep tensions within American politics. These tensions eventually erupted into the American Civil War, which began in 1861. The conflict involved multiple political and economic issues, but slavery stood at the center of the dispute between northern and southern states. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring freedom for enslaved individuals in Confederate territories. The war concluded in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy and the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. This legal change freed millions of enslaved individuals and permanently ended one of the largest slave systems in the Atlantic world. Elsewhere in the Americas, slavery persisted for several more decades. Cuba and Brazil continued operating plantation economies that depended on enslaved labor. Sugar production remained a major industry in these regions, and plantation owners resisted efforts to abolish slavery. Nevertheless, abolitionist movements continued gaining strength within these societies. Intellectuals, reformers, and activists organized campaigns calling for emancipation. International pressure also played a role, as European governments and diplomatic institutions increasingly criticized countries that maintained slavery. In Cuba, slavery gradually declined during the late 19th century as new laws introduced steps toward emancipation. The island officially abolished slavery in 1886, ending centuries of plantation labor based on forced servitude. Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Throughout the 19th century, Brazil's coffee plantations relied heavily on enslaved workers transported from earlier generations of the Atlantic trade. Reform movements gradually influenced Brazilian politics, and several laws introduced partial steps toward emancipation. Finally, in 1888, the Brazilian government passed the Golden Law, formally abolishing slavery across the nation. With this decision, the last major system of legal slavery in the Atlantic world came to an end. The abolition of slavery did not immediately transform societies into equal communities. Formerly enslaved individuals faced many challenges as they attempted to build new lives within societies that had long been structured around racial and economic hierarchies. Access to land, employment, education, and political rights remained uneven in many regions. Nevertheless, the legal end of slavery marked a decisive moment in Atlantic history. The institution that had shaped economies and societies for centuries was no longer supported by law in the countries that had once relied upon it. The Atlantic slave trade had transported millions of Africans across the ocean between the 16th and 19th centuries. Its legacy could be seen in the cultures, languages, and communities that developed throughout the Americas. African traditions blended with European and indigenous influences to create new societies shaped by centuries of interaction. Economically, the trade had influenced the development of industries, financial institutions, and agricultural systems across multiple continents. European port cities had grown wealthy through Atlantic commerce. Plantation regions had produced crops that transformed global consumption patterns. African societies had been affected by the long-term consequences of forced migration and shifting political dynamics. By the late 19th century, however, the era of Atlantic slavery had formally ended. New economic systems were emerging as industrialization expanded across Europe and North America. Global trade networks continued evolving, but they no longer revolved around the forced transportation of enslaved Africans. For centuries, ships crossed the Atlantic carrying people, goods, and ideas between continents. These voyages shaped the development of societies in ways that are still visible today. Languages, music, food, and cultural traditions that formed during those centuries remain woven into the everyday lives of millions of people across the world. History often moves through long stretches of time, changing gradually as generations pass. The Atlantic slave trade was one of those historical forces that unfolded over many lifetimes. It influenced communities across Africa, Europe, and the Americas, leaving behind a complex legacy that historians continue to study and understand. Yet history is not only about systems and economies. It is also about people, families, communities, and individuals whose lives unfolded within those larger events. Their experiences, traditions, and resilience helped shape the societies that developed across the Atlantic world. Tonight, as we finish this quiet exploration of the past, imagine the wide ocean under a calm night sky. The same waters that once carried fleets of ships now stretch peacefully between continents. The waves move slowly in the darkness, and the wind drifts softly across the surface. History continues, always moving forward, but the stories of earlier centuries remain part of the world around us. So now, take a slow breath, let the mind settle, and allow the past to gently fade into the quiet background of the night.